box. I want to be colorful. Well, that's right.
To get going, back on time today. First things first, that clock on the back wall, I have to announce, is about 5 minutes fast. It's not done intentionally to try to keep the speakers brief. I've only noticed it today. Well, good morning. I won't delay your morning for more than a few seconds, but I do want to give a warm welcome to the Hall Centre for the Humanities, which is where you'll be spending the entire day. I'm Victor Bailey, Centre Director. When I'm not in the Centre, I'm a modern British historian at KU. It's a glorious day out there, almost tempting to want to go outside, but if you haven't been warned already, it seems that Lawrence is under an infestation of oak tree mites, which bite you. So be careful when you do go out. The Hall Centre is a founding partner of the Institute for Digital Research in the Humanities, along with the KU Libraries and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. It's been a very productive partnership, and I want to thank the other two partners really for the good grace and good faith they've shown for many years in this joint enterprise. With the relatively small budget that the co-directors receive, the IDRH has done, I believe, a remarkable job. It's impossible to compare with the Virginias of this world, even the Nebraskas of this world, but IDRH has carved out its own important niche in the DH world. I'm deeply appreciative of the work that has been done for many years now by Brian Rosenblum, by Ariane Dwyer from the Department of Anthropology, and now Phil Stinson from the Department of Classics. This year's DH Forum is, I think, the 5th such, and by all accounts and by all appearances, the very best attended yet. It has depended upon the organizational efforts of a number of people, Brian himself, but also Elika Ortega, Pam Lack, Stephanie Gamble, and Tammy Albin. So thank you for all your work to those people. I hope your day in the center is enjoyable. We've been in existence as a center for well over 30 years now. We came into being around 1976 or 77, although we've been in this building only since 2005. We take the name Hall for the Hall family of Kansas City, which is the family that privately owns Hallmark cards. So keep buying those greetings cards. As an interdisciplinary center for faculty, we also, however, agree to graduate students being very much part of our events. And we really are here to help faculty develop their research, get grant assistance for their research, and get their research published in the humanities and in the humanistic social sciences. We call ourselves an interdisciplinary center, though I think I've always preferred the term interactive disciplinarity. As such, I think we really are an appropriate venue for the DH Forum today. If DH is anything, it is inherently interactive and interdisciplinary. So I wish you a productive day. I'm here for some of the day, though perhaps not the entire day. And Brian will now get that day underway. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Victor, for that welcome, and also for having us here at the Hall Center. This is our 5th year, as Victor mentioned, and this is the first time we've had it here at the Hall Center. Usually we're up in the Kansas Union, but this is a great space, and I think it'll be a great place for our events today. I just want to reiterate a couple things I said last night, and I acknowledge the support of the Hall Center and Victor Bailey, the KU Libraries, and our interim deans, Kent Miller and Mary Roach, and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and Paul Kelton, our Associate Dean for the Humanities. For this conference too, I also want to acknowledge KU Research and Marianne Graham and the History of Black Writing Project for some additional support for bringing participants here. And then, of course, for our amazing planning committee, Elika, Pam, Steph, and Tammy is in the back doing all the videotaping. So if you need anything throughout the day, they're all up here at this front table. There is coffee and refreshments in the back. They will be here throughout the day, so feel free to stand up, and we'll basically be in this room the whole day. So feel free to go back and get that throughout the day. And then we'll have a catered lunch around 12:15, I think it's scheduled. If we stay on that, and that will just be out in the lobby here, and you can come back in here and eat, or if it's nice and you're brave enough to battle the mics outside, you can outside. Let's see, I think that's all the logistical things. But if you have questions, please contact any one of us. So I think we're ready to begin. So to introduce our morning speaker, I'd like to introduce Stephanie Fitzgerald, who is an associate professor here in English and in the Indigenous Studies program.
Good morning. Our first speaker today is Christen Withey.
Kim is an associate professor in the Department of English, the associate director of the Digital Technology and Culture Program, and director of digital projects at the Plateau Center for Native American Programs at Washington State University. Her work explores the intersections of cultural heritage, archival access, traditional knowledge, intellectual property rights, the ethics of openness, and the use of digital technologies in and by Indigenous communities globally. Dr. Christen Withey received her PhD from the History of Consciousness Department at the University of California at Santa Cruz in 2004. Her research interests include issues such as open access, digital technologies, cultural heritage management, sovereignty, and intellectual property rights as they intersect with Indigenous peoples' rights and relations globally. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kim Withey.
Look at all of you bright and bushy hair on a Saturday morning here. Thank you for coming. I first want to thank Brian and the whole planning committee. What a great conference so far. I go to a lot of DH conferences and am invited to speak, and this one is really, it's doing something different, and it's doing something different on purpose, and it was a conscious effort to put diversity and ethics and these sorts of difficult questions right at the center of this conference, not at the end on the last panel, you know, the one about diversity as everybody's walking out the door. Oh, we're streaming this, aren't we? We've all been there. So I really, a hearty thank you to everybody here at KU and to Brian for doing that, because it's essential, it's important, and it's sort of what we want to get through today. First things first though, if you are tweeting, it's at Mukadu. That is Mukadu for those non-Mormon speakers out there. If English is your first language, just ignore the R. And please feel free to tweet your hearts away. But I want to begin and spend most of the time that I have this morning with the provocation of the conference organizers, because it is really important for us to critically examine the peripheries, barriers, and hierarchies that exist within this field at the intersections of our work as scholars across diverse sets of communities. What we're tasked with is a type of mapping activity I'm suggesting, to bring into focus the contours of the landscape of the digital humanities in order to forge new paths that might break down, challenge, or reroute some of these barriers that have been constructed. So to begin with, I want to spend some time laying out and unpacking this landscape, and specifically the points that sometimes get overlooked because they seem to just always be there. That is the most dominant strands of DH research and production, the ones that we take for granted. So digital humanities are rooted in fields of study dedicated to textual analysis and historical examination, and many people have written about this. Matt Kirschenbaum's What is Digital Humanities and What is it Doing in English Departments? If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's short, it's brief, it's fantastic. So I'm not going to retell that origin story here, but I do absolutely want to look at the effects of those beginnings. Origin stories tell us a lot about ourselves. As someone who has a background in cultural anthropology, I like to, I'm an ethnographer at heart, so I'm studying you as much as you're studying me right now. But the origin stories, they tell us about ourselves, they help us understand the past and define the future, and they allow us to draw and rearrange the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. So growing from these origins with a focus on text and history in DH, the present moment of DH is filled with practitioners that are extending these modes of inquiry to create visualizations with big data. It's the buzzword right now, right? Wrangling, searching, compiling data sets for interpretation and analysis to tell a story. There are also alternative mapping projects that bring together literature, history, and geography to raise new questions about the importance of places, nations, and cities in the circulation of knowledge. and of course, digital archives, one of the foundations of DH. And these provide new ways of exploring and linking and annotating and curating content across and between fields of study. So these digital practices mark a terrain on this map where data and narrative merge, and where the practices of the digital merge with scholarly critique. They begin to define a story about who we are and what we do as DH scholars. And as part of this map, in 2009, several scholars penned the Digital Humanities Manifesto 2.0, suggesting that the digital humanities bring together, quote, an array of convergent practices that explore a universe in which print is no longer the exclusive or normative medium in which knowledge is produced and or disseminated. That was the universe that they started to map. And they go on to define the borders of this universe, who's in and who's out, arguing that, quote, the digital is the realm of the open source, open resources. Anything that attempts to close this space should be recognized for what it is, the enemy. Full stop. Now, certainly as a manifesto, some of this is inflated prose. Manifestos by their nature aim to inspire and prompt action. And at least in American culture, there's no better way to do that than by labeling somebody an enemy. You want to rally people, let's have an enemy. So that the us knows who the them is in order to draw lines, mobilize people and resources. And part of this seemingly vigilant focus on open access comes from a general and often unreflective love affair with the ideal of openness. Who doesn't love openness? We teach our kids to be open, right? But it's not necessarily a critical appraisal of the cultural or historic bias of openness. The ideal of openness has deep roots in liberal scholarship and progressive notions of academic freedom and research. This is not necessarily a negative connotation. But while loving openness so much, I think we have forgotten that open is only one form of sharing. There are in fact many modes of sharing, only one of which is complete openness. In fact, we already practice these modalities of sharing in our everyday lives, online and offline. Long before Facebook came along, people used various social and cultural protocols to filter how and with whom they shared information. We are very rarely totally open with our information and knowledge. Circulating knowledge is an integral part of human culture. It makes us who we are. And of course, it's central to the digital humanities and the projects that we do. So Todd Presner has suggested that there have been two waves of digital humanities scholarship to date. First, large-scale digitization and technical infrastructure projects, again, focused mainly on text. That was the beginning of DH, with the goal of making these texts open and accessible. So we digitized a lot of text, we spent a lot of money on digitization and putting these texts up online, annotating them, PEI, etc. Then with a move to what he calls DH 2.0 more recently, he suggests an emphasis on producing, curating, and interacting with materials, especially those that are born digital. So these two waves certainly overlap, and I don't think either are complete, and I don't think he would suggest that either. But what I would like to suggest is not yet another wave, don't be afraid. But instead, I'd like to throw out a beacon in the distance of these waves as a reminder that as we continue to digitize, create, curate, and archive, that we also, and at the same time, unpack the underlying assumptions about the gaze that digital humanities is producing. These practices and the projects we produce are about seeing and being seen. They are quite literally grounded in a new visual field. In their recent book, Practices of Looking: An Introduction to Visual Culture, Marita Sturken and Lisa Cartwright argue that there is an economy of looking, whether tacit or explicit, in all cultural practices. Practices of looking, then, I'm suggesting, are deeply embedded in our cultural logics and social structures. And I suggest that they are then deeply ethical acts. So our gaze is deeply ethical. Our practices of looking tell us more about how we understand the world than what we are seeing. And here is where I think we should pause in the title of my talk today. I would like us to pause for a moment and look at what has been left out, pushed to the side, to the margins, or made invisible by these dominant discourses and the practices of looking that have been embedded within them. I am suggesting that as digital humanists, we have been surprisingly mute about the ethics of such digital practices. What do these say about our values? Who is allowed in and who might be shut out? I also think we are uniquely poised at this moment to make sure that the H in DH, the humanities, complements the technological impulse by emphasizing and fostering relationships between communities and pursuing the ways in which technology can bend to the needs of diverse sets of users, as opposed to a more consumerist model based on numbers, where software is judged by its imagined global reach. As we're pausing to think about ethics by looking at boundaries, one of the areas we should be looking closely at are the challenges content curation poses, specifically when we are dealing with communities who have been historically left out of the curation process and those whose voices have been erased or muffled within the public record. So over the last 10 years, with digital tools and platforms that rely on and privilege user-generated content, and curation growing in popularity, it's out there as a term circulating, we're all curators apparently. The modes and workflows for curation as imagined within this digital landscape have been linked to outward-facing export processes and practices. Indeed, the sort of read, write, import, export model is undone in these emergent practices of digital curation and digital archiving, where today, viewing, displaying, remixing archival materials are more central than just putting them in boxes and putting them on a shelf somewhere. So, however, these online and offline, the act of looking and the necessity of seeing is privileged in each of these projects and the practices. We need to think about how materials are found and used and repurposed and often goes unacknowledged. So this current, what I think of as the just-in-time workflow, suggests a process that begins with the notion of discovery. How do we find something? This notion of discovery replays a colonial collecting paradigm where content is imagined free for the taking. And if it's not free, you can't just go out there and Google it and rip it down from the internet. It's because dubious governments or corporations have locked it down. Those are our choices. Once found, curation does not necessarily involve providing cultural or historical or political content, but may simply just mean playful remix or ironic arrangement without proper acknowledgement. Finally, sharing with an unidentified public anywhere is presumed to be not only best practice, but a de facto public good. This model disregards the colonial histories of collection and upholds a notion of access that privileges the public domain as an unencumbered space. But really, it takes a bit of historical amnesia to forget that the public domain has never been very welcoming for indigenous peoples, whose cultural materials found their way into the public and private collections by dubious and oftentimes violent means. Our museums, our archives, our libraries are full of these materials that were never given to the public domain. So by disregarding this historic context, the default for digitization and curation becomes mired in competing notions of open access and the public good, where accessibility is synonymous to open to all, without regard for cultural, social, political, and historical contexts. This idea of openness circulates not just in scholarly ideals of open access, but of course in popular notions, where Facebook declares their mission to be to make the world more open and connected. No mention of privacy concerns or the fact that when you put your content up on Facebook, they just might own it. Similarly, Google's mission to, quote, organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. So we might pause to ask how Google decides the best way to organize information. And if universal accessibility is so easily and casually defined, is it even desirable? I'm suggesting that we can disrupt this all too quick binary between open and shut, where open is the default and shut must be suspicious. Instead, we can look to cultural nuances and diverse social systems to see the range of ways that people imagine knowledge circulation and access, and we can build, as DH practitioners, workflows and tools that respect these systems. So for example, for many indigenous communities, not seeing is a cultural imperative. Not seeing. In Aboriginal Australia, these practices of masking, deleting, and defaming images and objects are quite common. On one of my first trips to Central Australia is where I first saw this actual masking tape over a curated exhibit in a museum because one of the community members had died. And the curator was like, right? But how do we deal with this? And now it's more common in public places, in museum exhibits, in books and online archives and exhibits. There are warnings all across Australia that the images and names of deceased people may, quote, cause sadness and distress to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So these warnings are meant to make people pause before you enter. In Canada, the Musqueam Indian Band's online place name archive and exhibit requires visitors to accept their terms of viewing, not terms of service, their terms of viewing Musqueam places and hearing Musqueam stories in the Hunkaminam language. Only upon accepting these terms, which include, quote, being respectful and not reproducing any portion of the site without permission, can one enter. This actually turns the notion of terms of service right on its head. We're not thinking about copyright, we're not thinking about it. This is an ethical, they're asking you to act responsibly and be respectful. Similarly, the Blackfoot People's Blackfoot Digital Library has a terms of service and conditions for use, including a statement on knowledge acquisition and use that states, you are not considered a member of any Blackfoot tribe, nor are you considered a shaman or medicine person because you learned something from this site. This site is not for recreating Blackfoot ceremony by non-Blackfoot people. And we laugh, but why do they have to do this? Why is this not obvious? It's funny in the way that it's sad, it should make us all pause, as I'm suggesting. Similarly, and offline in the inland Pacific Northwest at the Northwest Museum of Art and Culture, their plateau collections are kept separate, and access is restricted to these objects from the general public, and only tribes may enter. These are all visual reminders. They're visual reminders of tactile, material, and embodied ethical practices of not seeing that change the default of curation and call into question assumptions about knowledge acquisition that the act of looking and practices of seeing presume, right? Seeing is believing, it's everywhere. It's how we think about knowledge. It's intimately linked to this idea of seeing. But what I just showed you in these indigenous systems disrupt this continued disavowal and this notion that information wants to be free. This narrative permeates our online viewing and the associated notion that varied viewing practice must be a dubious form of control or an abuse of power. Those things exist. I'm suggesting these are not one of them. These are cultural and ethical imperatives. So the vocabulary of censorship and open access actually limits our ability to see different ethical systems at play within archival practices, curatorial workflows, and modes of viewing. So we can learn something from indigenous systems of knowledge, circulation, and stewardship. We can see that knowledge is always grounded. It's rooted to local places and people. Even as it travels, it takes with it these cultural protocols for how to act in relationship to that knowledge. We can embed these diverse practices of looking and protocols for action into the architecture and aesthetic of DH practices. We can do that. For example, in 2005, in collaboration with several Warramungu community members in Central Australia, we launched the Digital Dynamics Across Cultures online learning space as part of the Vectors project led by Tara McPherson at USC. Our goal was to use the medium itself to disrupt the message of openness online. Like colonial frameworks of discovery, the expectation of online search is that you will find what you're looking for and you will be able to use it for your own purposes. Our vector site challenges the mode of knowledge collection and its attendant ethical assumptions. Therefore, we begin in place. Visitors to the site begin at a node that represents a physical, named place within the Warramungu landscape. All knowledge is placed, and all places have knowledge. You can't know without being there. Therefore, users can track their knowledge, and the dots you see are as you move from one place to the next. So when a viewer clicks on a place, they get a textual introduction and an overview of that place. This, for example, Manyamanda, is an old Christian missionary just north of Tennant Creek, where many of the children were removed from their homes and taken to this mission, part of the stolen generation, so that you learn a little bit about there. Then by clicking on the yellow nodes on the top bar, you get some specific information about this place. In this case, a women's ceremony. You're starting to learn a little bit more, and users get what they assumed they bargained for in a learning site. They're starting to learn something about the Warramungu. Isn't this interesting? So we're fulfilling that expectation, but then we're not. So as viewers continue to maneuver through the site, a photo may be partially covered because the person in the picture has recently passed away. Or as you are watching a video clip, you might be interrupted.
I put them in the back and I shave, can't see them. What I went. I couldn't see them. There was behind the shield. Yeah. Other people used to tell a story. There's a really old man. And there's his real man.
Or as you listen to a song, it may fade in and out. So the site is designed in such a way, we produced an algorithm that a random sampling of material will always come up with one of 9 protocols related to circulation and access. The 9 protocols that the Warramungu community already uses for their circulation practices offline. If someone is deceased, what country you're from, what family you're from, who's your kin. These are systems that already happen for knowledge circulation and reproduction offline. We're trying to mimic that online and get people to start to think about that circulation. We also purposely did not translate Warramungu language or song. We didn't clean up video or audio as part of our goal to disrupt the assumption about learning spaces. And I had a really long, when this site first launched, blog back and forth with an anthropologist who was really upset that we hadn't cleaned up the audio and that we could clean it up and he couldn't understand it. And I explain to him that that's the point. We want you to understand something else. And this is a PhD in anthropology. And I finally just, as some blog conversations go, you just get out of the comments because you realize but we were frustrating him. We wanted to frustrate him. This is not a site about Warramungu language and culture. This is a site about us viewing Warramungu language and culture as if we could in just sort of this really open way, understand. So instead, in each case, when a viewer is stopped, right, they're frustrated. So our goal then is to get them to learn about the protocol. So we have a short explanation. And also, in some cases, short animations explaining the protocols for information. And all the animations, all the artwork, everything on here was done by Warramungu community members. They did every single bit of this. This was not done by USC or Vectors folks. So this is a protocol for country, and it explains to people how people have responsibilities to care for country, and then not everyone can go there without permission, and so that's why you're being blocked from viewing this particular piece of country. So we hope that users move through the site, they'll grapple with their own biases about information freedom and knowledge sharing online. Through a set of alternative looking practices, we're not looking, averting one's gaze, or being denied seeing, to find a more ethical behavior and way of learning. It still is a mode of knowledge acquisition, just not the one we're used to. So as we were working on this project, it became very clear that the Warramungu community also wanted their own archive. We started working with the Warramungu community in Central Australia in 1995. By 2005, when the Vectors project launched, we were also deeply involved in a project creating the Ninkanunu Art and Culture Center, their own art and culture center in town. And Michael Jumbin Jones, who you see here, one of the Warramungu elders, was very interested in creating a digital archive for material that had been repatriated to the community from missionaries, from national museums and archives, etc. And as we were looking at the content and as we were thinking about the protocols for access, the protocols for viewing that I was mimicking using a Toyota and a Mac, driving from place to place, showing people what they could see on my laptop, we talked about how could we embed this actually in a digital space. How could you make this proper, in his words? So we started to think about creating that archive, and he called that archive Mukadu. And in Warramungu, Mukadu literally means dilly bag. And the dilly bag is where elders kept sacred items, and younger generations had to approach the elders to access that knowledge, and elders had to open that. It's a two-way street. It was a dialogue. And they would say if the elders didn't open it, the knowledge could die. That's the word they used in Aboriginal English. So this is serious business, and it's about a relationship. And so Mr. Jones also said that the archive, Mukadu, should be like the dilly bag, a safe keeping place, mimicking those same types of relationships. So 2 years later, in 2007, after 2 years of community consultation and feedback, we launched the Mukadu Wumparoni Kari Archive, a standalone browser-based community digital archive that enacts Warramungu protocols for viewing, circulating, and creating knowledge. So every piece of content in the archive is tagged with what we call a sharing protocol. How should this content be shared within the community? Is it men's business or women's business? Is it for elders only? From which family and which country do you need to be to view this item? This is a slow process. We uploaded items one by one. It reflects the community's emphasis on proper relationships, and it assumes a social and cultural relationship to the knowledge and the materials in the archive. This notion to create a digital archive using Indigenous protocols and embedding a new model of curation and information management actually resonated with Indigenous communities worldwide. But we knew that a one-size-fits-all model wouldn't work. We needed the flexibility to be able to accommodate Indigenous communities from Oklahoma to the Outback, and also non-Indigenous institutions, from something as large as the Smithsonian Institution to something as small as the Wisconsin Historical Society, who all have Native materials in their archives. So over the next 2 years, we built Mukadu CMS. So Mukadu is a free and open source content management system. It's totally configurable and customizable to the cultural and social needs of any community, cultural center, library, archive, or museum. Our current 2.0 version grew from what we call community software development. That is, every feature and function that is now in Mukadu is there because one of the Indigenous communities with whom we've worked over the last 5 years needed it, suggested it, wanted it. So we started with that core of protocols, and everything that we've added has been from community feedback. So it's important, it's not developer down, it's community up to our features and our functions. Most importantly for Indigenous communities and others, our terms of service. That's it. It's yours. This is not just a matter of privacy. This is a matter of sovereignty for Indigenous communities. And for us to be able to tell them, it's your content, It's your site, it's your protocols, it's yours at the end of the day. So first thing in Mukurtu to define then, I'm just going to show you a little bit about the software, are the communities. Communities are the who of Mukurtu. Communities group site users together and start to define access. So yesterday in our workshop, we created a community. We have here our IDRH protocol workshop community. So a community can be anything big or small. It can be elders, it can be women, it can be researchers, it can be tribal government officers, families. Also, and importantly, in Mukurtu, there is no default community. If you want to share and you want something to be open to the public, you have to define that. Every piece of content has to have a community attached to it. So if you want it to be public, you have to say that. And I find that really important and ideologically significant, that we have to suggest that the public is not nondescript, it's not neutral, that we're defining who you are. And so you start with defining the who of community, and then we get to the heart and soul of Mukurtu. And these are the cultural protocols. This is what sets Mukurtu apart from any other content management system. How is knowledge circulated and accessed within the site? And again, these are configurable to anything by any community. These are some that we see often. Again, gender, men's business, women's business. Seasons is one that we're seeing. So often within Indigenous and Native communities, some knowledge can be only shared in certain seasons. So you start to get a seasonal cultural protocol. Or sacred, again, materials that can only be used or viewed by certain community members. But if you're using this within your library or within your department or within your museum, you can have all kinds of protocols for access. You could have one that's to be vetted. So things that you're not sure, you're doing research and you don't know what to do with these yet, and you don't want to make them open, but you want to start to archive them, put a to be vetted strict protocol on there, and then only the people that are added to that protocol can see them. And then you can work with a community or work with a researcher and make sure that then the thing that you're going to open up eventually is something that should be shared. And the protocols can be layered, so you can have something that can only be viewed by men from a certain clan at a certain time of year. So it's not just an option of one or the other. But also importantly, in Mukurtu, we also wanted to reflect community histories and stories and narratives around content. As I said with the vector site, all knowledge is storied and placed. So we wanted to build out extended sets of metadata to allow Mukurtu to handle multiple records for one item. So as you see across the top, we have a record that was given back from the National Anthropological Archives at the Smithsonian Institute to the Plateau Peoples web portal that we run at WSU on Mukurtu. So we have the record from the Smithsonian Institute, and you have some information here. And then as we're zooming down, we see that we also have the community record. And we can have as many records as we want. There could be now a family record, there could be, an individual record for this, disrupting that notion of one object, one expert opinion, here's the metadata for it, this is all the record has to say. And if we look at here, there's some also other important things for how we think about curation. We have an audio description here. Any of the fields in Mukurtu now, cultural narrative, traditional knowledge description, can all have audio or video. We're disrupting that notion of the text, of that type of literacy, and also allowing for the fact that songs might be traditional knowledge, that a dance might be traditional knowledge. You can see all the related items for any image, and you can also, and importantly, have all the metadata over here, including the traditional knowledge labels. We started with traditional knowledge labels as a way to allow Indigenous communities to add tags of information of materials that are in the public domain. The labels educate others about materials and use and access parameters. They are a social intervention, not a legal intervention. Because these materials are in the public domain or owned by third parties because of the history of collecting, we cannot re-license them. However, a traditional knowledge label, much like a fair use label, informs people about that piece of content. So for example, an Indigenous community could add an attribution label to that Smithsonian image that I just showed you, which they did, by saying, please attribute the Coeur d'Alene. Yes, legally, the Smithsonian Institution holds the copyright to that, right? However, what we're saying is ethically, it's ours. Please attribute the Coeur d'Alene Nation. And so we put this attribution license on there. We also just created the family label as we were working with the Musqueam Indian Band, because often their knowledge is separated by families. So some of the information in people's dissertations and articles, etc., they're using the family label in their instance of Mukurtu to show that you actually need to go and talk to these families. This knowledge isn't actually appropriate for everyone. So these just are some examples of way that we're extending the notion of metadata and undoing that notion that metadata that we all look at and take for granted is somehow neutral, objective, and completely reflective of the piece of content we're looking at. That in fact there are other stories behind it, and that metadata is in fact deeply ethical. So how do communities use Mukurtu? I always get asked this, so I just want to show a few examples. Here's the Musqueam First Nation in Vancouver I was talking with you about. They are using it for a public art display, and they used our collections feature that we have now to build a collection of artwork and artists and biographies within the system. We also created an interactive map, not using Google Maps because Google decided that Musqueam territorial boundaries weren't worthy of being mapped in Google, so we had to create our own interactive map. Undoing Google's sort of stranglehold on mapping these days. Also importantly, they have their own internal site, the Musqueam Digital Heritage Platform, and these are specifically for their ethnographic collections, and this is internal only for people who come to use their collections. So importantly, I just want to show you that Mukurtu can be used online for that site. That's a public art site. It can be completely offline as well and run as a system on their own local servers. In Australia, the Mira Canning Stock Route project is a good example of a lot of content in a Mukurtu site. There's over 40,000 pieces of content in there from Aboriginal artists and community members up and down the Canning Stock Route track. If you're not familiar with the history of Australia, Canning Stock Route runs north-south, and it disrupted Aboriginal lives, and has a fraught colonial history. But what's so important about this project is what they've done is they've recreated that route by talking to Aboriginal communities all along the way. And so you have artists also depicting the Canning Stock Route. All of that is in their Warlungu instance with their own protocols in their own languages. And the Pascal Sherman Indian School on the Colville Reservation worked with us to integrate Western water science with tribal knowledge for their students. So what was important to them was for their students to be able to hear Salish and English at the same time as they were working on science, so they could bring together scientific terms and notions with Salish terms and notions. And then we work with the Karuk tribe in Northern California, and they created what they call the Sipnook Digital Library. And this is for all their food securities documents. They had a grant to do this, but importantly, they added traditional knowledge, community recordings, and photos to all those sort of foreign PDFs of food security documents to bring their view to this. So I just wanted to show you a few of these because I think these are all examples and ways of disrupting the more celebratory narratives of digital technologies and the practices of digital humanities, to instead foster a slower, more attentive set of practices that I think of as collaborative curation and stewardship, where we can jettison notions of objects and scale, where we can begin to see that as digital humanists, we cannot step away from the margins. We can't map only the centers. That as we engage with diverse sets of communities, the centers will and must shift. And as they do so, as practitioners, we become answerable for what we learn how to see. And with that knowledge comes the responsibility to shift our practices, to be more inclusive, and to be more wholly ethical. Thank you. And I'm more than happy to take questions, or you can throw things at me, whatever seems more appropriate. Yes.
I think it's quiet because we're all like, damn, that was awesome. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I want to ask a really pragmatic question. It's a sucky question to have to ask, right? But in pausing and slowing down, because I'm super on board with what you're talking about, but also cognizant of the structures of, right, tenure, hiring, et cetera.
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts about how?
Sorry.
I thought you might, about how to bridge that?
Yeah, I love Tara McPherson. If you all don't know Tara from USC, a digital humanities champion who pushed me as a just out of graduate school grad student to start pursuing this line of inquiry as really thinking about it in deeply ethical terms. And one of the things at our first Vectors meeting, 2005, I'd only been out of grad school for a year and I was in a temporary position, was just about to take my first permanent tenure track position at WSU, where I'm still at 10 years later, to bring these things to our departments, to our deans, to our provosts early on, which is what I did. In my very first year as an assistant professor at WSU, I said, I'm going to be doing these digital humanities projects. I'm going to be doing things that look like creating software, that look like creating websites. This is research, this is scholarly production, how can we count this? This is a move within academia, so this was not new, but I'm lucky. I had a wonderful chair at the time. I have a wonderful chair in the new department that I have. I have dean and provost who've been supportive, but that doesn't mean I didn't have to make the case. But I would encourage you to get those things in writing somewhere, that they need to be in your tenure and promotion guidelines. So they are now in our tenure and promotion guidelines. I got tenure, I don't know, a few years back, and it was, and I still consider and always will consider something like Mookadoo as a software. It is a tool. It is also research and scholarship. I mean, these are theoretical interventions that I am suggesting through Mookadoo. Is it a tool that can do things? Yeah, it's a tool that can do things. It's also an intervention into knowledge management, informatics, user interface design, all of those things. So I would suggest making early interventions on your campus, getting involved, multiple departments that work on similar things. So that's what we did. It's like English, fine arts, history, all of us are doing these things. Let's have these conversations, get them written into your TMP documents. I'm not saying it's to be easy, but that it is being done across the country, like MLA, and now I think the American Historical Society also has, so they're out there, and it's changing as for new scholars coming up. But, yeah. Other questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you, that was amazing, just amazing. We don't have to do this. Okay, all right. Okay, Jackie, I get it. Brandon Museum, Smithsonian, you name it. This question of colonial theft. And I mean, when I hear this, I'm encouraged because I see that there are ways of innovating. But when I go to those museums and I just stand there and see all that's there, I'm discouraged because I don't know how the kinds of ethical interventions that I see here can occur more broadly. So I guess I'm sort of asking, where is there's a continuum, I know. There's all this over here. I mean, I said Brandon because that was a place where I was just frozen in my spot. Because I didn't know there was so much stuff that had been taken and brought to Paris. So can you comment about that in terms of how we get from here to there?
I can absolutely, and I will begin by saying that we are partners with the National Museum of the American Indian and the Smithsonian, as well as the National Anthropological Archives. We're working on a project right now, the TK labels, with the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and that we work with several local museums. And I have to say that over the last 10 years, there has been a sea change. Things are changing. When we first started this, it was really difficult to have these conversations. On the heels of NAGPRA, there's still a lot of, it's changing. What we've learned over the last 20 years from NAGPRA is that actually opening up collections to Indigenous communities doesn't mean that that those collections are going to be removed from national museums and there won't be anything left and they're just gonna, in fact, what's been learned over the last 20 years is that what Indigenous communities wanted was that relationship and engagement. And there's wonderful museums doing great things. The University of British Columbia in Vancouver, the Museum of Anthropology, there's a certain stone, what looks to be a stone, that's an actual relation of First Nations communities, that they put to bed every night. They put a cover over it, they turn it around, they do what the community asks them to do for those belongings. And they have a wonderful set of exhibits that really get to this. One doesn't have anything in the case. I love it because it's about this not seeing. It's like, we can't show you this, but we wanted to teach you about this. So they have a whole interpretive display next to this empty case. It's like, it's awesome. I love that. It's been a hard road, and again, going back to practical things. It took us 3 years, but we have a memorandum of understanding with the National Museum of the American Indian for them to share materials with us for the Plateau Peoples web portal. And when we work with tribes who want to do what I call this sort of digital repatriation, and I know some people don't like to use that term for the return of digital materials, I actually think it is a deeply political act. And so, while I respect others who don't think it is repatriation, I absolutely do think it is, that in giving back these digital materials, it's not the return of bits and bytes and zeros and ones, it's the return of your language, your history, your culture, to be embedded in something, whether it's Mukadu or some other system. How are the communities going to use this? Language revitalization, cultural revitalization in their K through 12 immersion schools. Those are all actually happening with materials that have been digitally repatriated from national museums. So I would say, and if you go to conferences now for Society of American Archivists and the Music Council for Museum, anyways, ones that I've been going to, I have seen this shift. Are there still curators that talk about my collections, my stuff? Yeah, they're there. But I would suggest they're moving more to the margins. And most noticeably, our two biggest, the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian, have, in my estimation, been much more forthcoming and open recently with these types of acts and engaging communities and really wanting to and understanding that this is an ethical imperative and also asking, how do we do it? So it is a slow process as well. It's a slow process if you want to get it right. How do we do it with one community is going to be different from the other. But it absolutely is happening and shifting. And that's why I said it's this moment that those of us in DH who deal with these types of collections can make these interventions. Because you can go to those institutions with the communities and say, these are the records you have, these are the collections you have. Let's work together. What can we do to build a relationship around producing more informative narratives about these collections? So I think that that's what we have to do on our side as scholars, is to keep pushing, kicking, knocking on those doors. I mean, that's what it takes. Yes.
This is so exciting. Thank you, Kim, for illustrating the project. I have a million questions, but I'll just table one of them because it sort of extends the kinds of conversations we've been having, through post the workshop from yesterday. But just in terms of training the scale of knowledge professionals, because this kind of project is one obviously that's so deeply globally relevant, and it's a project that it's extending and building out great collaborations, but that takes so much work, and every institution needs to be who can interface in one way or another, but it also requires having sensitized knowledge professionals from the coding angle to the kind of community-based angle to the kind of building out relationships. I mean, just on so many kinds of layers. It's because it's so deeply interdisciplinary. So just in terms of, I don't have any thoughts about how to kind of scale. I know it's
I think the great thing about digital humanities is that we aspire to be interdisciplinary. I say that we aspire to be interdisciplinary because we're still oftentimes locked in some traditional humanities departments. So I think as digital humanists, we need to reach out to our I schools, our information schools, to our library schools. we'll say it again today, I love the librarians at Washington State University. They are awesome. These projects wouldn't exist without wonderful librarians who got it at a core level. We need to change metadata. We need to think about ethical practices of information sharing in really deep ways that affect our catalogs, our collections management systems, things that we thought were just neutral and they were just doing their job and we're just plugging in data. And so that absolutely needs to happen. So if we can partner, with information schools, with libraries, with the computer science programs on our campuses, teach classes together, do DH projects together. Do not keep your technologists separate from your scholars and humanists. Don't have the technologists meet and create the database and then you go your research over here and you all come together at the end. The reason these work is because community software development. What are the needs of the community? Keep going back to that. And then the engineers and the developers will start to shift and probably the scholars and the communities too. You're going to come together in a relationship. So I really hope that, we can actually enact an interdisciplinarity that brings those sort of ethical imperatives to all the multiple conversations that we're having. And there are conversations and there are iSchools and others that are starting to do this, but it needs to be at the level of courses. Needs to be at the level of courses offered, and also, these types of events and workshops where we're coming together, not just on the scholarly side, but bringing in coders, bringing in engineers, developers as well. There's great developers out there. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
I'd like you to tell us if the efforts that you have been involved in, which I think are totally admirable, have ever been discussed in the context of what UNESCO and the UN do. And I raise this question because if we're truly going to open anything, we are going to have to open the digital humanities as a world problem, not just simply a problem of the American Academy or the British Academy, but of all people throughout the world, especially what we, in a privileged way, call indigenous communities, and forget that we are also ourselves indigenous. So would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, yes, those conversations, particularly around draft documents that UNESCO has done in the UN with the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, have definitely been on the radar of these conversations, specifically at the Society for American Archivists, where these are being talked about, as well as within museum studies, particularly the UNESCO draft. Specifically this, yes, so WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is part of the UN, approached me in 2008 about using Mookadoo, before Mookadoo was actually built. We're still in the process, of scaling it to anything that could be considered not a one-off. With exactly this type of problem that they were dealing with a program that they were doing with the Maasai. Had the exact same types of issues around knowledge circulation and content curation. And so they're very attuned to it, but very specifically in terms of traditional knowledge. So actually my partner, Jane Anderson, and I, for the Local Context Project, 3 years ago, we presented at the United Nations. And it was a little daunting to me. And they were like, oh, we're really doing this. But we presented at the UN at the WIPO, for part of the WIPO conference, about using traditional knowledge labels. And so I have my doubts, however, that we are going to change things from an international level down. While I think the United Nations declarations and things coming out of UNESCO and WIPO are important, I also know that the grassroots, sort of ground level community on the ground, what are we doing now today, that those need to be more part of the conversation. So bottom up, top down, it's actually somewhere in the middle we need to meet. And so there's not as much of that community conversation happening at the international policy level. It's unfortunate that that is what international policy is at the moment. And there are people who are trying to change that. The folks that we were working with at WIPO very much were interested in infusing these local conversations into the international conversations. It's very difficult. And it's difficult in the United States to have a conversation about sovereignty when we don't recognize that we have 400, we have sovereign nations all around us in the United States today, right now. And, we don't have that conversation. So getting down to sovereignty in terms of museum collections is part of this larger conversation about a national history of politics that we don't want to talk about. That's one thing we don't want to see, and to bring it into that conversation. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question, except for to say, yes, those conversations are happening at an international level, and scholars are part of those conversations. I think we need to make community members more part of those conversations. I think we're way over time, and I apologize. So I'm all around all day. Thank you very
Yeah, she did great.
Let's just end there. There's nothing more to be said. Grab some mic walk.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Just coming here.
Good. Well, hopefully it'll enliven conversations throughout the day.
There's a spot right here.
Was it right here? Is this one empty? Okay, fantastic. You may want to take somebody else's seat.
Are you good? You think? Yeah, even I was trying. Yeah, we're here. Do that out there. Yeah.
I don't want to call it that either. You know what I mean? But just sort of signal that these conversations are happening. Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's not like that lecture is just okay, this is what the Right. Right. No, but then we're just saying that these things should be central. They should be part of the conversation. Yeah. Yeah, if you just go to Christen.com, all my publications, you can just download all of them. There's a one that you might want to start with is information really want to be free. That's probably the best Okay, there's an article that I published in American Humanities that's also on my website, and that one deals more a little bit on it's still talking about the same issues, but I deal a little bit more with those kinds of specific, so you might want to look at that. It's called Untitled. I'm here all day. Grab me and you can also feel free to email me You would still have to either and launch them on your separate institution, or you can get a cloud-hosted.net version. So it is open source software, so you can use it that way. Where it's like sort of a cloud-hosted version, then there is a fee. It's a little more difficult than WordPress once you ask them who's in the workshop, because I showed them yesterday. I mean, if you're smart, or like some version.
We'll be getting started in a few minutes.
Yeah,
So
if you want, it's not.
yeah, a few more minutes to get We'll get started. My name is Pam Lack. I'm with KU Libraries, and I'm a member of the Planning Committee. And I have the extreme honor of introducing the winner of our student paper. Dhanashree Thorat is a graduate student in studying Postcolonial Studies and Digital Humanities at the University of Florida. And she will be delivering her talk, A Postcolonial Reading of Digital Archival Structure. Please join me in welcoming our student winner, Dhanashree.
Thank you very much. I can't believe I'm going up to Kid to do this, but I have to, I guess. And perhaps I should say, I can build on her work and say that I would like to take up this idea that she outlined, that we need to slow down and think about the tools we are building and the DH projects we are working on. And I will do that in the context of archival structure and think about how interfaces and structures are very much political systems and the things that they enable and don't enable. And I'm going to do this in the context of the September 11 Digital Archive. And I won't go into this in a lot of detail, except to say that my work is rooted in postcolonial studies. And I actually have a satirical group that I just tweeted out that has a link to some of these sources. But a lot of the people today and yesterday have been or will be talking about how archives are not neutral. So I won't recap this earlier scholarship. So let me briefly introduce instead the September 11 Digital Archive, in case this is a new archive for some of you. This is probably the largest archive related to 9/11. It has about 150,000 items, so it's very, very big. About 40,000 emails, 40,000 first-person accounts, 15,000 images. And it's been up since 2002. It has a lot of well-known institutional partners. It's based out of CUNY and George Mason. It was acquired by the Library of Congress in 2003. And it has a lot of institutional cachet because of the people that they have worked with. And what I'm going to do in my paper today is to read the interface of this archive and make visible the political implications of its structuring and visualization. And I'm focusing on the interface because I think the interface is an ideological space. This is where the system meets the user interacts with archival content, and the interface mediates the user's experience of the archive by determining what and how the user can access archival content. The interface is also a map, so I'm thinking about metaphors like mapping and borderlands with the interface. And this map represents the underlying system. So the interface has to make interpretive choices about how to represent the system for the user. And hidden underneath the interface, but informing it, are logics of system structure and design. And of course, these logics are not neutral because they are shaped by ideas of how knowledge should be represented in computational systems and cultural ideologies of design. So studying the interface can actually be a way of understanding how underlying elements such as code, metadata, page design, hyperlinks, search features, database structures are ideologically and politically constructed. And I won't focus on all of those elements. I will mainly be talking about the visuality of the interface and then a little bit about the structure of the interface. And what I'm going to do here with the 9/11 archive is consider how the interface works with the content within a certain socio-political context to reproduce and reify one nationalist narrative of 9/11, which is this focus on citizen heroes. This archive reproduces other narratives, but I'm going to focus very much on it. Perhaps we can talk about other narratives in Q&A or something like that. So all of you have probably heard about citizen heroes related to 9/11 in some way. This has been a very repeated idea. Citizen heroes are average citizens who did something extraordinary after 9/11. This includes civilians who died in the World Trade Center and the Pentagon attacks, passengers who seized control of United 93, and very prominently, first responders, so firefighters, police, and rescue workers, many of whom died during these early rescue efforts. The citizens exist in a liminal space. They are soldiers, they are civilians, they are heroes, they are patriots. And in a moment of national vulnerability, these civilians and citizen heroes become symbols around whom the nation can coalesce. And we've seen citizen heroes in a number of cultural texts after 9/11, the very famous Thomas Franklin photo of 3 firefighters waving the flag with the rubble in the background, films like United 93 World Trade Center, and then the Portraits of Grief series, which was done by the New York Times. And what I'm going to do now is look at the content and structure of the September 11 digital archive and see how this one narrative has become hyper-visible. And I'm going to say basically that the alternative narratives which were in this collection have over the years become crowded out because of changes to the structuring of the collection level. So when this archive first went live to the public in 2002, this was how the collection level pages and the landing page looked. You can see that it's organized mainly by document type, email repository, image repository. Oops, technology. Where am I? Okay, let us go back. So be careful, presenter. Okay. And then one special collections page. And this special collections page was very interesting at this point because it incorporated a lot of these different narratives about 9/11 at this early point in time. So you have a tribute to 9/11 heroes, a video on 9/11, of the impact of 9/11 on airline workers, Arab American responses to 9/11, and then some very interesting other documents that included satire and comedy. There was a Russian website about 9/11 jokes. And perhaps this website was very politically incorrect, but it existed up there. And it suggested that there were all of these different ways of understanding 9/11. So even in this early list of special collections, you can see that the tribute to the heroes was always at the top of the page. But at the same time, these different narratives still coexisted. And just by being on the page together, you get the sense that you need to understand these different events and ideas and narratives together. Over the years, though, what has happened is that those narratives have disappeared. And currently, in the latest change after 2014, you only have 2 narratives which emerge from this page. So this is the current layout of the page, of the collections page. And basically, it is currently ordered by document type, so audio, art, digital projects. You have some organizational structuring here, but you see that there are 2 topical narratives or 2 topical collections. One of them is the First Responders collection, and the other one is the September 11 Bearing Witness and History collection. And these 2 narratives, these 2 collections stand out because they gesture to two very specific ways of understanding 9/11. The first one is the idea that 9/11 was a traumatic event, and people whose accounts are recorded in that collection are witnesses to a historically significant event. And then the second idea is that first responders are really crucial to understanding what happened during 9/11. So immediately the organization of this collection suggests to the user that these two preformed narratives of 9/11 are important over other narratives of 9/11. And if you look at the first responders collection, for instance, you begin to see how first responders became coded as really important to the American nation, as ideal citizens, as ideal workers. And this becomes very visible in many of the pictures in this collection. So you see pictures which depict apparently not workers, but wreckage. The workers are completely overshadowed by the wreckage, but they continue to work on. So even though they are confronted by this enormous labor, the workers are undaunted. And they work in these dangerous work environments, and they offer their labor to the nation for the eventual rebuilding of America, and of course that physical site itself. So clearing the rubble is an act of investment here in the future of the nation. In all of these photos, in many of the photos, as well as other documents that are uploaded in this collection, you see that the first responders are very putatively marked as American by the overwhelming presence of the American flag. And the fluttering flag which is raised above the rubble, and the laboring men are symbols of an uncowed American spirit. And of course, as these are preeminent symbols of the American spirit, these workers are celebrated, and the ones who died, their losses are mourned. So you have graffiti, artwork, thank you letters, pictures of street memorials, which issue this call to never forget the loss of citizen heroes in the 9/11 attacks. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that this collection very explicitly tells users who constitutes worthy of being celebrated and mourned after 9/11. Because the category of the victim is not something which is given a priori to the nation. It has to be constituted in these collective spaces and cultural texts. Now, of course, one might say that in a collection which is devoted to first responders, very naturally it will mythologize first responders. And of course, these people did very important work, very dangerous work. But what happens is that the same narrative crops up in a number of the other collections within this archive. And you see similar photos, similar ideas emerging in the 10th anniversary collection, in all the user-submitted documents, in various photography collections, so that this emphasis of this one narrative over-determines how 9/11 is understood. And a big issue here is not just the content, which is crafting this narrative, but also when the documents were collected and how they are incorporated in this collection. So 9/11, of course, was a very visualized tragedy. And most of the visual content pertaining to the attacks was taken either during the attack or immediately after the attack. And this is to be expected as public attention was most focused on Ground Zero and the Pentagon during this time. And photographs from that time period would be predisposed to showing the citizen heroes who were working in New York and the Pentagon around this time. But the other thing that happens, which is of interest to me, is the interface. How does this interface actually reproduce this narrative very strongly? And what happens with the September 11 digital archive is that the interface of this collection is particularly suited to displaying visual content, because visual content is displayed as icons. You get a preview for that, and all of the other items, other document types, actually don't get a preview. So if you were searching through this collection or looking through its items, you would naturally pause and look at the visuals rather than actually opening up some of these other documents. So by the hardwired logic of the system, visual content and visual narratives are highlighted for the user. And it's useful here to think about this very old essay by Self and Self, which is still quite relevant, in which they think about the interface as a borderland. And they write that computer interfaces should be mapped as complex political landscapes which are simultaneously contact zones and exclusionary spaces. And boundaries can foreclose meetings and they can hinder circulation. And this metaphor of the boundary is really amenable for the digital archive because the interface shapes what the user looks at and hinders access to other material and hence other narratives. For instance, a digital archive has a very vast trove of emails, which are those DOJ titles up there about the Victims' Compensation Fund. And these emails are basically complaining about gay and lesbian next of kin being denied compensation and the next of kin of undocumented workers who died receiving compensation. However, because there are not identifiable photographs which show gay and lesbian victims and undocumented workers in the World Trade Center, these groups and their narratives are marginalized because they lack visual evidence. And that becomes a big problem here. So the hypervisibility of citizen heroes, specifically the first responders, it occurs because of a number of reasons. There's not one reason that this happens. There is content, there is structure, there is interface. And the problem with this narrative doesn't become clear until you draw back from the archive and actually look at the socio-political context of this archive. And this becomes interesting because how do you actually tell users to consider that socio-political context? How do you cue users to thinking about the material in this archive a little bit broadly? And some of these problems have been discussed in scholarship. I won't address all of them, but just to gesture towards some of these. So for instance, scholars have argued that celebrating the lives of citizen heroes becomes a way to cover over issues of race and gender within the FDNY. And of course, the nation broadly, because there are insufficient photos of women firefighters, for instance, who were also involved in rescue efforts. So the documents in the digital archive reiterate that rescue work is a gender labor, which is open only to men. And of course, the Franklin photograph reiterates this because it shows 3 male firefighters raising the flag over ground zero. So again, rescue work is crafted as the domain of white men very specifically. And Hill and Helmers take up this idea and note that the idea that 3 white men could represent work at ground zero, but also the community of America and its spirit, seem to test the capacity of imaging to be inclusive. So the FDNY has historically been white, and in 2002 it was actually charged with discriminating against non-white applicants, but of course these racial and gender tensions become invisible in this archive because of the lack of visual evidence. And of course, after 9/11, the call was to stand as a united nation and to not talk about these kinds of issues. So in a related context, Connor writes that the heroic visualizations of the FDNY reiterated historical ascriptions of heroism to whiteness, and suggested that multiculturalism was in a way not needed because white middle-class men were the ones who eventually performed heroic acts after 9/11. And of course, since most of the material in this archive was collected in the early and mid-2000s, what's also missing is that some of these rescue workers now suffer health issues related to their work in rescue. And of course, those narratives are also submerged because you don't have decent documents, you don't have visual evidence of that kind of suffering. Of course, this citizen hero narrative was also militarized after 9/11. It was deployed in ideological ways, and these people became crafted as patriots, and then the US would go to war to recover their lives in a way. So there are a lot of issues with the citizen hero narrative, which are covered over because of the presentation of this digital archive. So I want to kind of summarize 2 of the ideas that I've brought up so far before I go on to what perhaps we can do about this. So one of the things I've said is that the organization of the collection levels is an interpretation of the documents underneath, because the organization cues the reader to what is important, what the themes, so to say, of the archive are, and how to engage with the archive. So I think we need to be really attentive to what the collection level organization, what the titles and names of these documents are telling users about what is important. And the other thing that I've said here is that the presentation of the content, that is the arrangement and display of visual material versus other kinds of material, also mediates user engagement. So this presentation can privilege without intending to specific content within the archive. And this arrangement might have something to do with the way Omega formats perhaps visual content. So I want to talk, before I end, I want to talk about some suggestions, because I would like to move from thinking about critique to perhaps what we can do with this kind of work in building archives, because I'm sure a lot of you are interested in actually building and not just critiquing. And I want to work backwards from this list, starting from hacking interfaces to transparency. And I highly suggest the work of Tim Sherratt, who presented at the DH conference in Australia this year. He talks about how we can repurpose interfaces to take power back from these interfaces. That's a fairly tech-oriented suggestion. So for those of you who are not very tech-oriented, this might sound very tricky. How do you actually rework the interface? And he suggests that we can actually write scripts. And so you can look at an archive of Australian newspapers and extract the names and faces of indigenous people who are buried in those Australian newspaper archives. So that's one way of doing that. Another thing we can perhaps do is rethink about the visual strategies of presentation. So instead of just pulling up search results and displaying them in this very linear fashion, perhaps they can be displayed spatially, topically, or temporally. So different ways of pulling up search results might reshift connections. Right? People can make connections between that material because you're seeing things in a different way. I'm very interested in decentering as a political and as a post-colonial ethic. And decentering, of course, is a way of drawing out different narratives which are buried, which are submerged under the dominant narratives. And perhaps one way to do that might be to actually do something with the metadata and pull up different metadata tags on the landing page so that there are no preformed narratives given to the user. Instead, every time the user visits that page, you have different ideas which are coming up based on metadata tags. And then finally, perhaps the easiest way and the least technologically oriented way would be to be more transparent about the logics of what you're doing in your archive. So how exactly is your archive pulling up search results? How do you determine relevancy of material in pulling up search results? So I think we need to have archives that actually tell users what are these underlying system logics that are pulling up search results, which are ordering materials in archives. So I will stop here because I think I'm about to be pulled off the podium here. Then perhaps there are other strategies that we can talk about or address. So thank you.
And we have about 10 minutes for questions.
I don't know if we pull up the actual archives and can look at it. I won't try it. There are questions. Conclusion.
Yeah, first of all, great talking so much for your time. You made a passing reference to this phrase, never forget, and I'm very interested. Thanks. You made a passing reference to the phrase never forget in the context, and it's been used previously for events like, which are more traumatic, you could say, of the Holocaust, but it's appropriated for this event as well. In your experience of looking at the archives, did you come across this phrase? And from your experience, what do you think it means to people, or what are the various meanings that people put behind it? What are we not supposed to forget?
I think never forget was actually also a very recent Twitter hashtag after the most current anniversary, and people were tweeting with that to say, well, these are the things we don't forget. And I think in this particular archive, it's definitely those two ideas. One of them is that 9/11 was a traumatic event, which is also a very particular way of understanding 9/11 because perhaps it was not such a big trauma. And scholars have also written about that. So not forgetting, I think, that this was a historically significant event which affected American lives as a traumatic wound. That has been one of the things that you don't forget. But I think the other thing is definitely that American citizens lost their lives. And I think what happens here is that this archive doesn't suggest as much, and not just the archive, but other cultural materials don't tell you as much that the people who died in the attacks were not all Americans, right? I mean, it included people from a lot of different countries. But somehow, in the rendering of all of these people as victims, they've become Americans because they died in this American tragedy. So their framing of the victims has become dominated by this discussion of nationality. And that's related not only to the FDNY or to these other rescue workers, but civilians in general. Have you visited the 9/11 Memorial in New York? That might be an interesting site as well, which does similar work with coding victims as Americans. And everybody who goes to this space looks at 9/11 as an American tragedy. So you mourn this as an American, even if you are not American, so to say.
All the way from Mike. Thanks. This is very fascinating. Great job. I appreciated this. As a historian, a lot of what's going on with the 9/11 archive has happened over and over and over again. Creating memory, creating a nationalist narrative, including voices in regular hard copy form in the archives. This in the digital world. How has that changed? What is new here with the digital? Why is this maybe different from those standard published papers of President X or President Y?
Actually, one of the things that I didn't talk about, this was part of my work in post-colonial studies, because what I suggest, in fact, is that there has not been that much of a change, so that the absences that are encoded in colonial archives are encoded in very similar ways in digital archives. So I've actually found it very useful to draw those connections between colonial and digital archives and to see the colonial archives in the genealogy, in the development of digital archives. So in fact, I would say that there are very similar things, unfortunately, which are happening, especially as material from colonial archives gets digitized. And so the absences which were in the colonial archives are now actually in the digital archive as well because of the material which was collected in that time period.
I would add to that, the digital world might democratize a lot as people can start now creating their own archives, and it kind of challenges us, I think, as scholars to step up our critical game and look at all of these different archives.
And I think that has been an interesting thing because certainly the medium could be democratizing, but there are so many practical constraints with access, for instance. Because I think one of the issues with this archive, users can't submit documents to this. So I could go in there and add my account of 9/11. But if you are a marginalized subject, for instance, if you are a Muslim who experienced some kind of discrimination after 9/11, if you experience the gaze of the nation state, so to say, all your life, are you actually going to go in there and say something very critical of the nation? Because this archive, as I said, has a lot of institutional push, it has all of these institutional partners. So how does that gaze, to use this earlier term, actually inform what marginalized groups can say and cannot say in that archive?
Well, there may be what we envision as democracy. Democracies can be exclusionary as well.
Of course.
That's kind of what I'm thinking. So, but thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, trying to keep up with the schedule a little bit. I would like to introduce Amardeep Singh from the university. He's going to be talking about the archive gap. Please help me welcome him.
And thanks to Adhika for mentioning this conference to me. I hadn't heard of it before, and it was on her encouragement to apply that I sent an abstract, so I'm happy to be here. And I'll just get started. Pioneering work by digital archivists like Jerome McGann of the University of Virginia helped lay the groundwork for the conceptualization of a set of best practices for digital archives that have been widely replicated in subsequent projects. That said, some scholars associated with race studies and gender studies constituencies, as well as non-Western literatures, have raised questions about the ways in which the first wave of major digital archives essentially reinforced the Anglo-American canon. Authors like Walt Whitman, D.G. Rossetti, William Blake, Emily Dickinson, and Henry David Thoreau were, by about 2008, well represented online by thorough, thoughtfully designed, and technically sophisticated web archives. These archives frequently feature page images of manuscript drafts of the complete works of the authors in question, as well as, in the cases of Whitman and Blake, exceptionally deep access to different versions of printings and key texts. This same level of attention was generally lacking with reference to minority writers. As Stephanie P. Browner puts it in a recent essay, and I think I don't have my slides up here. Let's see. No, it's good. As Stephanie P. Browner puts it in a recent essay, scholars of race and ethnicity do not yet get online and find themselves in a deep, comprehensive, well-linked, and indexed world of materials. And Browner knows whereof she speaks. She's edited one of the very few digital archives dedicated to a 19th century African-American writer currently available. So it's a single author archive. I mean, there are other kinds of archives like slave narrative archives and whatnot. But that she edited the Charles Chestnut archive, and it's well worth a look. Looking beyond the US and Europe to the colonial world, Adeline Coe notes that, oh, no, I did something wrong. There we go. Adeline Coe, where are we? Adeline Coe notes that many open access, publicly funded projects in the literatures of the 19th century concentrate primarily on people of European descent and obscure the impact of imperial endeavors in the 19th century. The digital archives we've been dealing with in 19th century British literature are often a bit quiet about empire for a reason. Many of the above mentioned authors actually had surprisingly little to say about this hugely historical and political reality, a huge historical political reality. Here I'll be surveying some dimensions of this problem, which I'm calling, for simplicity's sake, the archive gap. One aspect of the archive gap, the simplest and most obvious, pertains to whose work is chosen to be archived and whose is not. You don't need a PhD in digital humanities to see that there's a discrepancy. But there's more to it. The archive gap, as I'm conceiving of it, has several dimensions. Again, for simplicity's sake, I'll split my consideration into two parts, one historical and the other contemporary. And I should also mention, for those of you who are Americanists, I have an alternate version of this talk that I did as part of like a teaching lecture, which focuses specifically on archives to 19th century African-American writers. And you can see that, I think if I have my, yeah, so there's a, on my blog, if you Google that title, Race to Canon and Digital Humanities, there's sort of, it uses some of the same concepts that I'm talking about here, but it applies them to things like the Charles Chestnut archive. And a few other examples that specifically in the US context. Today I'm more in the British colonial India context. The historical dimensions of the archive gap are largely outside of our control. To put it quite simply, we'll never be able to recover what was never preserved. Authors like Rudyard Kipling and Walt Whitman left behind manuscript versions of their texts, as well as typescripts. They left behind reams of letters, diaries, sometimes other kinds of texts, right? So we have James Joyce's laundry lists, right? His shopping lists and his and various kinds of reminders and to-do notes. We don't really have that, let's say, with late 19th century, early 20th century writers from India. These types of handwritten texts simply weren't preserved as much or as well. This has had consequences for our digital presentation of these authors' works. I mean, there are some exceptions. The writer Rabindranath Tagore, for instance, did leave manuscripts that were carefully preserved, and these have been digitized. These have been digitized at the official Tagore archive called Vichitra. Tagore, of course, was like a modern Shakespeare in Bengali, thoroughly canonical within the Indian frame of reference, right? So in a sense, if we're looking at this as an example of a marginal or a less canonical writer that's only less canonical within a US or British frame of reference, this is very much the canon if you're looking at Indian literature. We couldn't do something like this with authors who are somewhat less well known, somebody like Amardeep or G.D. Isasi. So both writers that I've worked on and trying to do some archival research on, and you reach a certain limit, and there's just no more letters for a whole decade. There's nothing, and it's gone. They were burned, they rotted, they were eaten by mice. They're just not there. The historical archive gap has had implications for the formation of the field of digital humanities in the contemporary moment. Many of the primary editors of earlier digital archives published significant scholarly works describing the decision-making processes as well as the new tools and technologies they developed to create the richest and most flexible possible resources. Scholars like Martha Nell Smith, Ed Folsom, Kenneth Price, and Jerome McGann have used their respective digital archive work as opportunities to theorize what digital archives can be, and they've written compelling arguments that digital editing ought to be seen not as an extension of print editing, but as a fundamental transformation, the advent of a new textual editing paradigm. The move away from linear codex-bound printing allows a much more straightforward indexical presentation of multiple versions of text and modes of text, and it makes previously difficult collation of textual variants easy. The removal of printing cost considerations makes the inclusion of large numbers of images in digital collections also much easier. This in turn enables much greater editorial transparency and inclusiveness than was typically practiced during the era of scholarly print editing and printed texts. And the open-endedness of digital collections allows frequent updating of collections as new manuscripts and texts might be uncovered after a project is already underway. And so I'm getting a lot of that from those scholars, that is, especially I think people like Ken Price have actually written out books about their digital archive work, and there's a really good book called Rescripting Woodman that he and Ed Folsom wrote together. And so there's a lot of these ideas are in these texts. And so they've not just created them and built careers around creating these archives, but also helped to theorize what digital archives are. So here are some strategies for responding to the archive gap, and I'll now talk about my own project that I've begun to kind of develop that will try and kind of have embedded within it a sort of critique of this archive gap as I go forward. One strategy for redirecting digital collections to mitigate the archive gap might entail further following a trend that is already well underway, namely to move away from single author archives towards thematic collections that show how larger groups of writers were linked together and interacting at given points in time. The emphasis on author networks shows how writing is first and foremost a social act, and the most successful and influential writers in the modern period have almost always been figures who were deeply engaged in intellectual conversations with a broad range of interlocutors who influenced their works. The shift in emphasis from single author to author network is also structurally brings less canonical writers into the conversation at a much earlier point. So we're not really trying, let's say, just to kind of, if we have a Whitman archive, let's have a Charles Chestnut archive that's as good and as rich. The idea is, let's look at 19th century writers in a social network, perhaps around a thematic kind of cluster of issues, and build an archive that is going to be multi-author from the get-go, right? And so we're not catching up and trying to kind of replicate what we did with the Canon. We're just rethinking exactly from the starting point. I mean, that's kind of a little bit. The problem there is that, of course, those archives are already there. So then, we can say that, but we were, in fact, in another way of thinking of it, de facto, actually playing a kind of catch-up game. Maybe, I mean, if you want to be self-critical. So it might be more effective, as I said here, in the long term to produce archives that use the network paradigm to show how the minor figure and the major figure interacted and perhaps had a conversation of mutual benefit to their respective careers. So, I mean, I've already said that. The idea of centering canonical figures in digital archives through a network-oriented approach has informed my own thinking behind the project that we started quite recently. I have to kind of say, I mean, in the presence of people like Withey, this is just at the very starting point of what I'm doing here with the Kiplings. I'm going to call the project the Kiplings in India. And Rudyard Kipling, for those who don't know the name very well, is the preeminent author of British India, to a British author representing life in British India. His poems, short stories, novels, and journalistic accounts of India painted a picture of the lives of British people settled in India that had a huge impact throughout the English-speaking world, as well as here in the US. Much of what Kipling wrote about India, especially his hugely successful Jungle books and his novel oriented towards adults about India called Kim, most of those things he wrote after he left the country in 1888. And I've been interested in the period of time during which he himself was living and working in India, as well as his parents, who were there for many years before him. And kind of studying it as a formative moment. How were they, I guess you should say, how were they learning about the country? Where did they travel? Who did they meet? One discovery has been the degree to which the Kiplings actually collaborated together on their writing. And so one part of the project is focusing on drawing a connection between, especially between father and son, Lockwood Kipling and Rudyard Kipling, and also between Rudyard Kipling and his sister, who is, her name was Beatrix, people call her Trix Kipling. And they all published stories together, often without kind of claiming some differential authorship. They would publish them just simply as 4 Anglo-Indian authors or 3 Anglo-Indian authors. And historically, we can figure out who wrote what. And the Kipling scholars that I've been engaged with are very keen on saying, this is written by Rudyard, this is written by Rudyard. They're not very keen on what was written by sister. And so part of what I've been interested in is, well, not just who wrote what, but also the fact of the collaboration, and what does this mean for each of them, right? Not just for the great author who came out of it, but this kind of the idea of literary collaboration as being kind of really formative and powerful experience for all 3 of these people. So that's kind of the general just within the Kipling family. Beyond just the family network, there's a broader circle I've been interested in, the network of voices and ideas circulating in the emergent Anglo-Indian public sphere in the late 19th century. Rudyard Kipling started out in India as a journalist, so much of my research focus has been on his newspaper work, and actually his father's newspaper work as well. It was really as a journalist for the Civil and Military Gazette, I should have a slide, yeah. The Civil and Military Gazette, that we can see the young Rudyard Kipling getting what we might facetiously call a degree in India. His reporting gave him a reason to travel to different regions around the country, from the one where his father was employed and where he lived in Lahore, to talk to different sorts of people, including senior administration figures, down to kind of working class Indian people that he would encounter. His access to a ready-made publication venue also gave Rudyard Kipling a chance to find his feet as an author. In his first years as a writer, he published nearly everything he did creatively, first in the newspaper before collecting it in books. I'm interested in charting his developing ideas and emergent authorial voice in the context of other debates that were occurring at the time, the debates about the status of Indian women in marriage law. This is a time in which there was a push amongst the British to raise the age of consent for marriage for young women, for girls, the major religious reform movements that were underway, the Arya Samaj and the Singh Sabha movement, and of course the emergence of the Indian National Congress, which occurred during the time that the Kiplings lived in India. The first meeting was 1886 or 1887. It might also be worth mentioning that in the 1870s there were 2 major famines, which Kipling's father Lockwood covered for one of the Indian newspapers. Kipling also had, through his father, a rather tendentious and jingoistic orientation to British rule that remained fairly consistent throughout his career. So one of my strong desires going into this project was to make sure that it wasn't just about the Kiplings, but also about the India and the Indians that they may not have understood the way we would today. This makes me a little different from archivists who enter into long-term projects out of deep and unchanging admiration for their authors. I'm interested in producing an archive of the Kiplings that also makes clear that there are aspects of what they had, what they said and did that are problematic or even offensive. So this is an archive in effect that aims to critique its subject. Right? So it's an exploration. It's based in a certain amount of, it's based in a considerable amount of admiration for what they did, but it's also in awareness that the way they thought about India and Indians is not the way I see it. And so that gap, that differential is something that's important to what I'm doing, not something that I'm just going to paper over. And so exactly how to represent that is not always sure I know the answer yet. I'm still working on some of those things. It is very different. The only other existing substantial Kipling archive that's out there is produced by people who are deeply passionate about his work. They're real Kipling fans. They're old school Kipling. Often there are people who are either descended from people who lived and worked in the British Empire, or they have that kind of connection. He's one of us, and I'm not one of him. You know what I mean? That is an important difference. Part of that critique, and this is another way of challenging the archive gap in my own project, is to look for Indian voices in the record that might be present but remain marginal. In Lahore, where the Kiplings lived and worked, there were two daily newspapers in English, the Tribune and the Civil Military Gazette. This is the more government-oriented one. Kipling wrote for this one, this is the CMG, newspaper that had a strong connection to the colonial government. Alongside these newspapers were numerous papers and magazines published in Urdu, Punjabi, and Hindi, all during this period, the 1870s and 80s. Some were daily, some monthly, some were highly sporadic. So while I've been digitizing microfilm of the CMG, there's no digital archive of it that exists right now. I've been looking for the archives of these newspapers with rather limited success. So many of them, including important Indian newspapers from that time period, just simply don't have archives that go back as far. Some do, and they're somewhat sporadic. I have been finding there's a resource I've been working with in a group of scholars in India who run a resource called the Punjab Digital Library, and they have some partial collections of newspapers that I'm interested in, including one called the Gurmukhi Akhbar, a Punjabi newspaper published during exactly the same period as the period where the Kiplings were writing and living there. And I've been looking through it, I've been translating it on my own, it's slowly laborious. My Punjabi reading is mediocre, and so at some point I may enlist help, but it's been really invaluable and interesting to see the gap really between what was covered in this newspaper on the same date effectively as what was being covered in the British newspapers, and just how different they really were. They really are kind of remarkable. Just you would expect, okay, something major happened that the British thought was front page news. There's a big war in Burma happening. There's an earthquake. The Indian newspapers, especially in the vernacular languages, are just not covering those things like at all. Like, this is not important to you. I guess it's not. It's other things are important. So that's been interesting for me to learn, and I'm still learning, I guess, as I go on that. Here's another aspect of the archive gap comes in. While the Civil and Military Gazette was exhaustively and preserved and microfilmed, Indian language newspapers were much less well preserved. Those that were preserved are generally preserved by private collectors rather than government-sponsored librarians. The collections are partial and often in not very good condition. So this is one. There's a number more that I want to find, and I'm at this early point in trying to find them. Interestingly, one partial source of information about what was in those papers was the British paper itself. The CMG had regular sections through the 1880s and 90s devoted to what were translations from what they called, that's the wrong page, let's see. They had regular sections where they would translate what they called the vernacular press. Admittedly, these focused on local Urdu and Hindi papers, so the Punjabi weeklies that were being published in Lahore are never mentioned, which maybe suggests that they didn't have anyone who read Punjabi working for the staff of the newspaper. And these translations served an official government function. They were part of an extensive surveillance and censorship effort that aimed to prevent Indian language print culture from becoming a space that could subvert British authority. So they were reading these to make sure that people weren't saying things that were scurrilous or anti-British. And they were presenting some of that material, right? And that's actually, there's a mixed plus in it. It's valuable in the sense that, well, it gives me access to this. I don't think this newspaper is preserved anywhere, the Kashful Akhbar. I don't think it exists. There's no archive of it. So I know a little bit about what these people were saying in that paper, but it's a specific selection, and it's specifically included. I'm out of time, or I have 2 more minutes. Okay, I'll wrap up. Anyway, so yeah, there's a mixed plus. You can see that it's also part of a surveillance effort. So let me, I have just a couple minutes left. Let me just show a couple of quick things, and I will, I'll just show my slides and deviate from my script because that'll be faster. Some of the other things that they chose to include in the CMG that I've been finding and I've been trying to study and analyze, they had some Indian names. There's a guy named Madhava Rao who they regularly included, and they called him, his column was called The Native Thinker, which tells you a lot, and it's a very loaded and fraught column title. And he often, in his columns, this column, for instance, is talking about the native penchant for flattery. And so how Indians like to flatter. So it's underlining and reinforcing a stereotype that the British had of Indians back for the British consumption, right? So this is kind of really symptomatic quality to what they chose, to the kind of person they would give a column to who was Indian. I've been interested in the back pages of the paper. So the main newspaper often has very limited coverage of Indian names and voices that aren't authorized, that aren't in that kind of category, right? People who are either Maharajas or incredibly sympathetic to the British. But there are some odd little memes that I'm finding odd things happen in these back pages. So there's one name that I've been tracing and tracking as I've been seeing it kind of proliferate in different pages in the back of the paper. So there's a guy named Singh, who is described here as the accountant for the Civil and Military Gazette, and he's listed here as having a son on one of the back pages, on one issue. On another issue, the same Singh, and I believe it's the same person, shows up as the secretary of a religious reform society, and their meeting is summarized here. And so I'm interested in that. So he has multiple kind of facets, multiple lives. He shows up also in a Kipling biography at one point. He worked in the Senate paper for 40 years, and he knew Kipling when he was there. And so there's an account of him by a Kipling scholar from the 1930s who goes to visit and talks to the same guy, Singh, who's still around. So I'm one of my jobs has been to take these types of stray, this is just one small example, 0 minutes left, to take these kind of stray figures that appear in the margins of these papers and see what can be made of them, connect dots, historical dots, kind of undergo a kind of recovery process. And if there's a story, at some point there will be a column or a section on the archive that I'm developing that will be just about these types of figures, right? Figures that are that we are pretty much lost in history, but not entirely. And so both the British resources can be valuable in doing that, and the Indian papers as well. So one possible outcome might be that as I get further into the Punjabi papers, that I find more stuff about this particular guy or other people that I'm sort of beginning to research. So I'll stop on that note, and thank you everyone for listening. Do we have a minute for questions? Yes, we do. Yes.
You started on this particular thread suggesting strategies that we could use. And the notion of strategies. It seems to me that the notion of the book that we always think about in academic terms, that everybody has to create an archive. That replaces the concept of the book, part of your research, when you leave an archive, a trail. Right. And so those archives proliferate, and then people doing research can have building blocks to go with something else. And so that even though I think you're right, moving from a single author to the, to a larger cultural historical context is really a valuable intervention. I think the notion of everybody just creating an archive as part of your research that you lead, that can be accessed just as the book that results from the research that you do. So I think shifting our thinking more is what we've been talking about earlier. And that's a strategy that I'm using with the graduate students here. You've got to leave an archive. You got to produce it, you have to leave it. That's part of the book that you do.
Yeah, that's true. And there may be a book as well, and certainly for some of the well-known figures in archive studies, in the archival world, they have produced books out of the work that they did. That's not my goal right now. My goal is to just build this and see where it goes and not have a linear kind of develop this. I'm not really aiming for a book. I'm aiming for cool stuff that tells me something that I didn't know about what was happening, especially what's happening around the Kiplings in India at that particular moment in time. And so there's not necessarily that endpoint. And we'll see how things go and how people receive it and whether it's successful. Then maybe there will be, but maybe there won't be a book. So yeah, over here.
This is really lovely, thank you. The project reminds me as well, it's brought to mind Michel Trouillot's work around silencing the past, and this notion of history as nothing but a bundle of silences anyway, the Haitian anthropologist who looks back at the period of independence and sort of the Haitian Revolution, but then also tries to do this excavation around the kind of missing characters and voices and these sorts of, it's a whole narrative of kind of almost thought experiments in the same way that this also is sort of, as you say, like a series of experiments to see where they go, to kind of, and they play out as sort of like, what is the mystery of Sanssouci, like the palace, the palace of the Haitian emperor post-independence, and then tries to play out some of the kinds of possible narratives of some of the characters whose voices have gotten lost in the same kind of way. And I wonder, beyond the sort of tracing, in terms of techniques, the kind of characters that you're excavating, what other kinds of tactics, experimental tactics and techniques are sort of in development, and those really, whether they fail or work, I think they're fascinating as attempts to look at archives as failed documents in some ways, or clearly partial documents. So.
Right. No, there's lots of things that are kind of rumbling. And as I said, I'm in an early stage, but there's one particular example I can give, which is there was a controversy over a child bride in the 1880s named Rukmabai. And she sued to be divorced from her husband, who she had been married to kind of without her consent when she was 10 years old. And the British were outraged by this. And it was kind of constant front page news for years. For like there were dozens, if not hundreds, of articles just about her in this newspaper. And she didn't live in Lahore; she lived in Bombay. And she was in every major British newspaper that was in English. And there's a kind of extraordinary disproportion in the amount of coverage that her case received versus virtually any other Indian woman on any issue in the British-controlled newspapers of the time. So I'm interested in that gap, in that disparity. And I mean, so one DH thing I could do that would be kind of more techie would be to just quantify it. Like how many stories are there about her versus any other Indian woman, and how many other Indian women's names appear in British newspapers during this time period? And I'm somewhat confident that it would be something in the range of 100 to 1. That her story was everywhere. They were obsessed with her and her divorce and child marriage and what's wrong with Hindu culture, and we have to reform this and fix this. They treat the women abysmally. That's why we're here in India, right? And the Indian women otherwise, I mean, even the character that I'm interested in, this guy Nick Christen I was mentioning, his wife's name doesn't appear in the paper, right? Indian women are just not there in the British papers, but she's everywhere. So that's the kind of thing I've been kind of beginning to play with and try to accumulate enough. The problem is I don't have full access yet, and so the quantification experiment kind of will wait a few months or a year before I even can get to that point. But I'm definitely planning to try that and see what comes out. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just curious what computational text analytics techniques you might be applying. Okay.
I'm not sure yet. I'm still thinking through some of that. I'm unlearning tools, and I'm relatively new to formal DH. I've been a digital tinkerer for a long time, but not somebody who knew how to do this kind of thing until very recently. I mean, there are some things that I could imagine using those kinds of some of those tools for yet, but I haven't really.
Wondering, how is Kipling viewed in India now? And is there anyone doing research? There's been a lot of documentation and research on the Raj in general since independence, but in particular with Kipling, how is he viewed in India? Is he involved in curriculums and research in India?
He's not loved in India. I think he's in some of the curriculum. I think he is. I didn't realize that would be quite as anyway. That caused a chuckle. But I mean, but some of his stories are still popular. They're still known. I think a lot of times without reference to them. The same way the Jungle Book is just kind of this cultural, almost like a kind of cultural mythology now that is spread without reference to its author's name. I think that there are kind of some of those things are still there, but I think that there's a strong awareness of the racism in many of his stories and in his comments about Indians. And as a result, there's been, I think that people are Johnistan a little bit. I think there could be an argument that people should be more interested in him than they are. And so I'm not interested in a kind of apologizing or that kind of recovery project, but I'm interested in, what's the full picture here? The kind of the pluses and the minuses of this, of the work of not just him, but actually of, as I said, the whole family. So yeah, but I would say generally speaking, he's not viewed with great love.
I guess the reason I asked the question is there any scholarship involving him and other things that were going on at the time that you're trying to research yourself? In other words, events were going on at the time you wrote for the British. Yeah.
Other things that are going on, I'm not sure, I didn't understand the last part of the
Well, I mean, during that time period, so research into that time period, where he would have been involved with the kind of things that you're looking at, day-to-day events that are censored by the British, that researchers are looking at.
I mean, there's a lot of historical religious material I'm interested in, religious reform movements that were very vibrant at that point in Northern India, especially. They're not things that Kipling knew about necessarily, so they're taking me away from that, and this kind of was almost like a kind of centrifugal force where I'm starting with the Kiplings and then find myself getting further and further away from what they actually had concrete engagement with. But they were happening in the same time and often in the same place without them even necessarily knowing it. So I have colleagues in comparative religion and religious studies that you talk about 1880s in Lahore, and their eyes light up because it's an really exciting period when Indian religions and Islam were undergoing this kind of major kind of rethinking and kind of modernization of the discourses what constituted those religious communities. So at the International Congress, it's also emerging. There's a lot of different things that are happening, and I'm researching those things in the historical record outside and separate from the Kiplings, but I'm also hoping to apply what I can learn there back into the archival project that I'm building. Does that answer the question? Yeah. Okay. Probably I should close. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Great, thank you. So next up, Jennifer Isasi, PhD student from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, presenting on Visualizing History of the Malone Community Center.
Hi everyone. I was going to invite you to explore the website that I'm displaying here while I was talking about the project that we did at the DH practicum class at UNL. But the website is not going to show on your laptops because something about the firewall, the network connection, something like that. You can check it on your phones if you want to. It's working on the phones, not the laptops. So rule number 4 in Stephen Lugar's 7 Rules for Public Humanities dictates, I quote, community is complicated and best defined by the community, not by academics looking in. Public humanities programs acknowledge that there already exist community organizations, institutions, and leaders, and try to work with them rather than come in and try to create programs that we think the community needs, unquote. Yes, Stonewall, extending the notion of the public humanities to the field of the digital humanities, recently wrote that the public digital humanities is built around network learning communities, not repositories for content, and its scholarly product is a conversation, one that engages a broad public while blurring the distinction between research, teaching, service, and outreach. As we know, many communities are unable to benefit from academic assistance in creating programs because oftentimes these programs tend to focus on academic use rather than the benefits for the community the programs are serving. So today I'd like to talk about the importance of doing public digital humanities by examining the process of building a digital humanities project for the Malone Community Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, through the creation of cultural heritage artifacts from the center. So first, let me tell you a little bit about this organization. The Malone Community Center in Lincoln, Nebraska is a social hub for the Malone community or neighborhood. With the influx of African Americans moving west and settling in Lincoln in the early 1930s, there was an overwhelming need for representation within the larger Lincoln community. The distinct African American neighborhood required a voice in politics, the job market, the education systems, and the public recreation programs. The Lincoln Urban League branched off the Omaha Urban League in 1932 as political representation and began to open up new opportunities for the neighborhood. Clyde Malone served as a director of the Lincoln Urban League, and his dedication to the community's children is the reason he serves as a namesake for the current organization. Due to different opinions on the ultimate purpose and goals of the Lincoln Urban League, the Malone Community Center broke away from it in 1955 to better serve the immediate community. The Malone neighborhood has undergone numerous changes in physical boundaries and has endured housing crisis and general discrimination from the mid-20th century Lincoln community, and the center itself has moved location several times, yet the community itself has always managed to stay together. The center has always been able to provide safe and fun social events, community representation, and a sense of togetherness, and is a defining influence within the community. Though the Malone Community Center is vital to help the community has formed and thrived, it went largely acknowledged individually from the Malone neighborhood as a whole. Current Malone Center Executive Director Larry Williams approached the Digital Humanities practicum class about developing a living memorial for the center, and they wanted a product that extended beyond their original idea of constructing a statue or a mural, and something that was easily available to the general public and that still highlighted the impact of the center today on the community. Therefore, last semester, our class on the DH practicum at UNL was challenged to create this living memorial of community center as a digital source that will illustrate the Malone Center's political and social history. The project group formed by Kylie McCormick, who is a historian, Eric Saxon, an art historian, Alex Kinnaman, an English major, and myself, a Hispanic Studies PhD student, immediately envisioned a thin data-driven digital product. We thought we could collect all their things, like photos, videos, sounds, everything, organize it and create an archive, like the traditional archives we're used to see with this type of material. This website was originally going to feature a map
The map was going to show the geographical changes the community has gone through, and we were going to incorporate an academic workspace for scholars. However, after speaking with the several members of the community and reviewing the vast amount of long forgotten social and cultural artifacts they have in the center, we realized that producing a digital humanities archive, a traditional one, of our own was not enough, and more importantly, it was not going to be adequate for the organization. Being immersed in our academic fields, we initially failed to see that we, the academics looking in, cannot define a community that we don't belong to, and thus we cannot create a product that we think is most useful. We came to the conclusion that developing an apparatus to allow this group to explore the history and take active part of the recontextualization of their own voices was going to be far more productive for community outreach. For that reason, and after several iterations of our first idea, remember, archive, website, and map, this project was designed as a facilitator in the social aspect of the Malone Community Center to be the means that allow users to be not only readers and spectators of an archive, but also to act as producers and collaborators in the archive. In his paper, Towards a Cultural Critique of Digital Humanities, Fioramonte claims that the, quote, the artifact influences and at the same time is influenced by its context, or in other words, technology is always part of the culture. In order to be able to create such a digital facilitator and translator, the team first had to understand where and how this new tool will fit in the community center. After talking to them, talking to the director and other community members, we first embarked on a traditional research process to examine its history, paying special attention to the first part of the study, African American settlement and migration, a history of the Malone Community Center, Nebraska, by Dr. Tekla Ali Johnson. This research was focused on the political and social groundbreaking events within the Malone neighborhood, and it set the main historical framework we needed in order to feasibly carry out the new task: search for and organize meaningful data and cultural objects in the center's private, non-digitized archives. For this second step of digitization of materials, we first asked ourselves one of the most important questions for these type of projects. Who is it going to be the audience? Who is going to use this website? In this case, the project can reach a wide audience formed by scholars, community members, and the general public, including children and young adults that are an active part of the community center in Lincoln. We believe the project accomplishes the Venn diagram that uses some pictures for the digital public humanities, making a, quote, a scholarly work legible to the public and helping it find an audience as a form of outreach, community building, and advocacy, close quote. Since in order to not exclude anyone from the audience that we envisioned, we decided to focus on social and cultural events to complement the political issues we had already learned about and portray all of it in a meaningful form. In this way, we also follow the Malone Community Center's position today in the city. That is to work to honor and strengthen the community by creating a space where every participant can develop to the full potential. A significant aspect of this project is to trigger participation in history curation within the community, and it is therefore essential to have a product that is both sustainable and flexible. As scholars in academia, we often have access to resources to create specific tools that require elaborate coding, a lot of money, and specialized technology. However, we need to acknowledge that outside an academic campus, few groups or communities have that access to specialized knowledge in technology or the resources to afford any technology at all, as it is the case in this community center. Thus, after exploring different options and discussing them with our client, we decided that Omega was the best option for a management system to collect and create data from their own experiences. Though the main feature of the website, as you can see here, is a timeline with pictures and text that extend for many decades. We incorporated also the option to add videos, to add recordings from the past members of the community, and it also offers the ability to create exhibits that contain material that are not doable for the timeline, because they have a vast amount of pictures, for instance, and not all of them are relevant to a storytelling type of timeline. In addition to the many disorganized materials in the center's archives, including board minutes, newspaper articles, letters, photographs, videos, etc., past and present members have preserved photos that can also be included in the moving history. And I mean personal pictures of different activities they held during the years in the center. Additionally, this feature timeline was developed through a free application created by NiLab called Timeline.js that functions like a traditional Excel spreadsheet and is therefore easily manipulated by individuals with limited technical experience. So no one in the community center is knowledgeable about technology. So we try to search for tools that were the easiest ones for them to manipulate. Both tools, Omeka and Timeline.js, make a visually stimulating and impactful platform where text and visual objects can tell the social and cultural history in a new public manner. Along already having a tool to explore their history, visualizing history, is going to allow this community to connect its past members with present participants, linking the old with new generations, as it seeks to recontextualize the many voices that were visible in this history due to the lack of thorough recording and publication. Digital means not only open a large window to display a project, as Luber points out, I quote, "It opens the opportunity for many voices, many ways of telling a story," unquote. The participation of these many voices can also be accomplished by making a sustainable and flexible digital project for this community or other communities. If we think about them as context providers to prompt community members to write and speak and be read and heard, and ultimately to become a tool to begin a collaborative dialogue on the production of their history, instead of us making their history while we are outsiders on the community. Though the team was able to digitize and put together a general view of the social and cultural significance of the Malone Community Center, there are many gaps that can be filled in still. Giving the community the control of the project, this can be accomplished in two different ways. So we built this archive, sort of archive, and then we gave the product to the community center. First, it is necessary to train a member of the community center. In our case, was the director of the community center that was willing to learn how to use these tools, how to maintain and continue adding archival material to the timeline and the exhibits, or if they want to create something different too, they can do it. This includes some technical instruction and direction on where to locate different resources they could benefit from, such as technical support for the hosting site, interested academics in developing some kind of research from this website, and assistance in community outreach. In this manner, the project allows for the continuation of research work on the private archives once we were done with the class, and that was in May. Secondly, the website is built to expand and includes a call for any personal materials that are not in the archives. As the editors of the issue on digital humanities, public humanities of the New American Notes Online point out, I quote, "Amidst current initiatives invested in big data and thinking at scale, we can all too easily ignore what has not been digitized, who is anonymous and why, and to what effects on the production of history and culture. Though the archive has not been built on a big data basis, though at first we thought we could do it, its main purpose is to be widely accessible and give a voice to different members of a relevant center in the city. We were aware that the past participants of the Malone Community Center are not acknowledged in the current site due to the fact that we were not able to locate any materials about them. And as a result, we have also integrated a small-scale crowdsourcing movement. We have a page on the website to call for more material for the archive. Defined by Rich as, I quote again, "the act of taking work once performed within an organization and outsourcing to the general public through open call for participants, the project is going to benefit from this act of small crowdsourcing as it draws attention to the idea of collaborative and cooperative efforts to achieve a particular goal. In this case, the goal is making an otherwise forgotten history visible for the community, the city, and cultural heritage in general. In sum, we would like to advocate for the humanities to work outside the perimeter of academia, because in our experience in translating our digital humanities skills into a public humanities project, we came to several conclusions that I think are relevant today. We found first that it is necessary to understand the community's needs to work towards the end rather than what we consider most relevant as academics. And second, that they understand the product that we create in order for the product to be beneficial for them as much as possible. Having constant discussion with several members of this community allowed us to create a product that was tailored to their needs rather than to academia's benefits. We also need to determine and cater to the audience, particularly varying literacy levels of potential users, in this case because it's for our community center, and we needed to create a product that can be easily accessed and explored by a wide range of users. We envision this project to be used by children, by young adults, by the elder in the community, by scholars, by anyone that is working on the community. Finally, we learned how to handle sensitive subjects that were vital to the history without causing the incidents to be relieved. In this way, we believe that this project became an approachable platform that empowers a community to curate their own records in order to participate in the preservation and dissemination of a cultural margin otherwise forgotten by our current obsessions with digitizing only what we deem important for our own academic fields. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
So the Urban League was founded in 1932, is that not looking at the timeline?
The one in Lincoln, yes.
1932. That's an interesting period to really pull material from. So it may be that even though you're focusing on Malone, it's that larger social and cultural context.
Yeah.
And so nobody, for instance, has pictures. I just saw that King came to Lincoln at some point. So no photographs.
The material from the 1930 to 1935, I think, or even the 40s, was placed somewhere in the community center.
It is somewhere.
It might be. It might be someone has some records, pictures of that time, but the ones that they have in the archive was values. It was they have some photos or something like that, and they missed it. But we try to look as much outside the archive as inside, and that's what we got in as necessary too, because we had a specific time to the website.
Yeah. So since you and the class worked with the community center, since you all worked with the community center and since that class is now over, have you seen actual more materials added and the training that you provided?
Not yet. Not yet.
How long ago was it again?
We were done in May as a global semester. We gave them an overview of the website, the archive, and we trained them in June. We haven't seen anything. They've been having a lot of activities in the summer too. They were very excited about the project, like having everything there, but it's also members that have no technical knowledge at all. So they were really happy about having a website, being able to take pictures from the old times history, but they don't know exactly how to manage getting all that they can in the archive yet. So we are still working on helping them realize how they can do this, how it can help them. We also wanted to prepare some activities for the children in the community to do something with the archive so that they can incorporate to the activities they have, after school activities they have with them. So we are still working with them to provide more ideas, to help them if they need help, like figuring out how to get the pictures to the website again, we can go again and help them. So we are still working with them, even if we are done with the semester.
All right, thank you very much.
Sorry. I did that. Okay, good. Thank you. Sorry. Sorry about that.
Let us welcome our next speaker this morning, Amy Earhart. Amy is an associate professor of English at Texas A&M. And many of you are probably aware of her project, The Diverse History of the Digital Humanities, which was an inspiration for this conference and has spearheaded many of the discussions that we are having here this morning. Amy?
Thank you. Okay. Today what I thought I would try to do or start thinking through is I want to think about digital humanities as it's structured rather than DH as theory, practice, or field. And by that I mean that I'm well aware that DH has it's an amorphous and fluid concept or practice particularized in various disciplines, national contexts, local environments. But among all of these, I would argue that the Digital Humanities Conference, held every year in varying international locations, represents a means of identifying the field and its practitioners. And I want to start with this. I think we need to sort of unpack that conference. I don't think we've been very critical about what that conference means to representations of DH. So I want to talk about that today. That said, just to give you an idea, if you are not familiar with the conference is functioning under an umbrella structure of ADHO, okay? And it's the Alliance of Digital Humanities organizations. You can see the several different organizations that fall into that. So I think it's really interesting. This is truly an international, in what I would say is the best sense of how these things are conceived, conference. So I want to talk first, though, about some of the issues we've seen through this conference and give you a little background about how DH as a conference represents big DH, and how it understands itself in the field. All right, so the 2012 International Digital Humanities Conference was held at the University of Hamburg and had the auspicious theme of digital diversity, cultures, languages, and methods. The conference's choice of diversity as a theme made me feel like we were finally getting somewhere, that DH was finally understanding how crucial it is for us to understand diversity as connected to our work and our community. I went to the conference feeling incredibly hopeful. By the time the conference ended, however, I was feeling frustrated with the entire state of the field. The diversity highlighted at this conference was the diversity of nation. Hey, look, we have Germans, French, and Americans here, honestly. And language. Look, we speak German, Spanish, and English. Sure, that's one form of diversity, but there was so little discussion of gender and even less of race or class that I felt really alone by the time I had left there. And I think what was really hard was that the conference's theme was even, because of the way it was treated, was even more horrific, right? Like, just don't even talk about it then. And since the 2012 conference, the DH community has increasingly, and the conference has increasingly been a site of tension over who belongs, who do we value, what do we do? Whether it was the 2013 Nebraska conference, where we had to fight to have a woman added to Keynote the following conference, the 2013 conference during which I was told by Twitter that we should just stop talking about these issues, the 2013 conference where the awards committee admitted publicly that they had made an error in the graduate student award selection and hadn't bothered to consider gender, resulting in a skewed awards field, i.e. 70% of the folks attending the DH conference are women, but the conference awardees ended up first pass having no women in the graduate awardees. Or the 2015 conference's treatment of women, as you can see represented here. The 2015 program, inclusion of an all-male, all-white Frontiers Journal board. Obviously, DH is still a site of conflict. And by that I mean not just DH, the field, but DH as represented by the conference, okay? The latest DH dust-up has occurred just within the last week, where an organizing committee was unable to think of a single woman to give a keynote for their event. And it seems to have been, I think, the last straw for many, and has made us, the community, grapple with how we should move forward, or even if this is a fixable issue. One response was to create a list of women, sort of binders of women, right? And the creation of this list seems to suggest that those who couldn't find a woman for a keynote in a field where, again, 70% of conference attendees are women, is merely misguided rather than willful. And here I want to point to Jackie Brenneman's comment, which, and I agree with this, she says, this is a nice idea. You know, while I agree with this sentiment, is it our job to Google it for them? And of course, we ran into this problem when we listed women in the field. And I just want to mention that when we mentioned, you know, there were lots of women, one person who was organizing the conference said, well, how do I know if they're any good? I need to see videos. I was like, oh, that's a news criteria selection. And he didn't back down. I guess I'm partial to Jackie's blog response, where she writes, there are no more excuses. You know we are here and that we do damn fine work. Going forward, all male panels can only be constructed as a choice, not an issue of ignorance. We have been busy building the communities we want to see within DH, and now we've taken time from our research, our teaching, our lives to pull together information for you. Now it's your turn to do your part. Beyond our continual work to call out such behavior, and I have to say, don't you feel like we're stuck in second wave feminism? We can't even figure out how to resolve the woman question. We haven't even gotten to issues of race, gender, or class. Or to bail out, certainly a legitimate and reasonable response to such aggressions, our community has been publicly searching, trying to figure out how we might respond to such problems. While I don't think there's one solution to resolve this, it's a problem that's systemic to academia, to society. I think there are multiple approaches that we might follow to move forward. I want to think through one possible way today to open discussion of this to the larger community. And accordingly, I welcome your feedback, because I feel really unsure about how we might begin to address this systemically. And frankly, how we might begin to address this systemic and frankly soul-crushing issue within the structures of digital humanities. So, the digital humanities, I would argue, as constructed by the conference, is just one narrative of our field. I want to propose that we build an alternative narrative that reclaims early activist digital work as our progenitors. Such an approach is not novel. We've seen other areas do this. My field is Africana Studies, and I always think of the work of something like Arno Press, even though I know that has some issues, Arno Press or the Negro University Press, which reprinted hundreds of Black author texts in the 60s and 70s, effectively returning these texts to the study of history and literature, completely reshaping the narrative of the field. What would it mean to bring early diverse DH projects to the fore? What would republishing these projects, creating a network of such work, look like? It's crucial. I would like to see those of us in digital humanities who care about issues of inclusion and power look back to look forward, to create a digital garden of our mothers, to draw upon the traditions of those who came before, to create digital work that is enmeshed with social justice and alternative history that we might use to displace the exclusionary one currently in circulation at representative conferences of the field of digital humanities. In Alice Walker's 1972 essay, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, she turns back to mothers and grandmothers, often anonymous creators full of unused or unwanted talent that drove them insane. Deeply creative women who went before but were stymied by racism and sexism, who had the creative spark, the seed of the flower they themselves never hoped to see, or like a sealed letter they could not plainly read. Walker asked, what is my literary tradition? Who are the Black women artists who preceded me? Do I have a ground to stand on? From these mothers is left a legacy, guided by my heritage of a love of beauty and a respect for strength. In search of my mother's garden, I found my own. What does it mean to find our Zora hidden in the weeds, in the field, in the archive? Who are our foremothers? Who was there before white violence and Black resistance, a project I have with Tanisha Taylor, the Black Press Research Collective, the wonderful project by Kim Gallen, Zita Nunez, Maura Hinder, Benjamin Fagan, Karam Hassan, Joe Boserman, and the Colored Conventions Project, Gabrielle Foreman, among other such digital projects. And what does it mean to have a different digital humanities legacy to broaden the canon of what we see as our originating digital humanities work? From the mid-90s to the mid-2000s, there was this explosion of digital sites that championed work previously excluded from the canon. I've written about this in my debates article and also in my forthcoming book. These are digital literary recovery projects, and they saw themselves as radical and activist social justice collectives. And I have to say, we have a wonderful example here at Kansas of this, the Project on the History of Black Writing, which began in 1983, and I believe, from what I can tell, the web presence started in 2001. These are some different versions of it. These sites built during these periods were largely labors of love, launched by scholars interested in disseminating materials that they found buried in difficult to access rare book rooms, crumbling newspapers, and unknown journals, and of using the digital space as a place to enact social and political change. Such work envisages digital scholarship as a tool that might be utilized to meet the needs of women, queers, and people of color. The case of digital publication, the ease of digital publication was what allowed the broad range of these small-scale recovery projects to explode in this early period, as most of the projects were produced using simple hand coding of HTML or then later HTML editing programs. Digital Recovery Project URLs revealed that the creators of such projects often publish their materials on personal web spaces allotted by colleges and universities to their faculty and students. Technologically inexperienced users could create a simple textual project using low-cost and low-expertise methods, an approach contradictory to much of contemporary digital project development that tends to be conducted with more complicated approaches, TEI XML, databases, tools, data mining, and algorithmic approaches. And I want to emphasize that the low threshold at this moment of digital studies resulted in a broader use of technology and a more inclusive digital development. And I think that's something we really, really need to think about. Not that I would argue against the sort of high-end digital projects, but where is the space for sort of entry point, content-driven digital humanities? That feels like those works have been completely pushed out. And I think that has led to some of the issues we're contemporarily having. And while I would argue that many early digital projects might be included in our alternative history of DH, I want to focus on those projects produced by scholars within the academy, as these are the same groups and individuals that could attend the Digital Humanities Conference, that could make up its governing board, that could present the work at the conference and contribute to the journals sponsored by the organizations that put on DH. Such early projects are often idealized, localized, idiosyncratic, but they use technology to promote inclusion and shared understandings of voice and power functioning, according to Moore and Mitchell, as both a relational mechanism that alters connections between people, groups, and networks, and as a cognitive mechanism that operates through alterations of individual and collective perception, providing a foundation for the creation of imagined communities. And a hallmark of what I call the DIY recovery projects is the development of this virtual community through various linking strategies. Projects often reference other like-minded recovery projects or activist projects through a list of links, creating an ever-expanding virtual network, right? This is the old school hypertext, which we often poo-poo as, oh, well, we did that in the 90s, right? But I think what we need to recognize is that these are really influential curated hyperlinked sites. We have things like Alan Liu's The Voice of the Shuttle, Randy Bass's The American Studies Crossroads Project, and Donna Campbell's American Writers. And they were used to construct a community of scholars to shift ideas. Such projects provided a means of navigating the newly emerging web at a time when search engines were non-existent and then unreliable, and more important, a way to create these communities of interest. The importance of these sites has been unremarked upon by digital humanities scholars, a remnant, we seem to say, of late 90s web culture that now seems simplistic and out of date. Yet I would argue such work is pivotal to the formation of our alternative digital humanities due to the values of community and connection through such technological practices. The other sort of issue I want to talk about, and I kind of want to riff off of some of the discussions this morning because I think that really contextualizes some of my concerns with this. Open access was certainly there in these early projects. Now, I think a lot of the projects I'm looking at are textual recovery, so they have very different understandings of how open access can be used. So I just want to sort of foreground my comments on that. The notion of digital work as open source was vitally important to these folks who pioneered digital humanities work. If scholarly publishers would refuse to print the scholars' work, then scholars could self-publish this material on the web. And I interviewed a number of folks from these early projects, and they all said the same thing. I went to a press and I found all these great women texts, or I found all these great texts from, African American literary history, and the publisher said they're not commercially viable, so I put them on the web. And you've heard that story over and over again. So such projects played an important role in the reshaping of humanities culture as scholars used their digital work to correct what was missing or invisible, or eluded. For someone like Donna Campbell, the lack of contextual, social, and historical information in the print anthology spurred her 1997 launch of the American Literature site. This is a piece from it. In an interview, Campbell called the project, I had an interview with her, she called the project a political statement that brought scholarly materials to a broad audience and published texts that were left out of anthologies, including such important work as Maria Cristina Mena's The Vine Leaf. The short story has since been anthologized, but Campbell's digital edition was the first to be republished since the original publication and remains the only version freely available on the web. Such work tied to DIY activist movements that bled into scholarship is among the earliest representation of what I would say is a realistic understanding of open source scholarly publishing, and like curated hypertext needs to be reconfigured within our history of digital studies. I also want to mention that it's crucial to think about what this means to digital scholars like Donald Campbell, who have done this amazing pioneering work, but are continually displaced by the structures of digital humanities organizations. Way back in 2006, I was invited to participate in a roundtable called Prospects for Digital American Literary Study, which was presented at the American Literature Association. And Campbell was invited, as were numerous scholars, including a lot of folks from the Whitman Project. Donna and I spoke afterwards about her relationship to DH, and she was exceedingly uncomfortable about where the field was going, as she felt, even in 2006, an outsider. She viewed her work as content-driven, not technologically driven, and felt like conferences like DH were increasingly focused on techniques and approaches rather than the humanistic concerns of projects like her own. Some digital scholars see this over-determination of technology as a disturbing trend that leads to a narrow digital literature or digital humanities approach. For example, Amanda Gailey and Andrew Jewell call this trend a hipster ethos that makes absent celebrations of content-rich digital humanities projects. I would say that nowhere is this tension manifest more apparently than at the Digital Humanities Conference, where much of the discussion about who's going to keynote, who do we give scholarships to, turns on assumptions about the sort of DH that is important, where technological innovation often trumps concerns with humanistic values that I want to center in this alternative DH. Also, as part of our alternative history of DH, I suggest that we might look back to the work that is unapologetically political, that is committed to enacting social change through technology. And here I want to highlight Professor Abdul Al-Kalaman's work. And he was sort of, to me, he's sort of a really pivotal first wave, if we want to talk about first wave DH scholar. He is a professor emeritus of African American and Library and Information Studies at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana. And he's launched numerous Black activist digital projects, including Brother Malcolm, still, I would say, the premier scholarly source of Malcolm X materials online, and E-Black Studies, a foundational digital project in Black studies. Formed from activist politics, his work is staunchly open source and emphasizes the creation of activist online actions through digital resources. And I was thinking about this when we were talking about open source earlier. I think there's folks coming at this from a Black studies perception, often use sort of open source in the same way some of the folks that worked on actions with Ferguson or Sandra Bland used Twitter to sort of reveal. So open source becomes sort of a political activist kind of understanding that's built into their projects. So Abdul writes, our philosophy is based on three concepts: cyber democracy, collective intelligence, and information freedom. So he talks about these three as sort of the crucial forms of his work. This philosophy means that he has included teacher training and student materials. He includes social activist contacts. And to me, this is sort of one of the places that we might look back to sort of think about how we understand our work in a long history of such activist work. All right. I could list numerous other early projects and scholars who we should consider part of this alternative DH history. These are our mothers who created our digital gardens. The problem remains that this work is often overlooked, invisible, and even disappeared. While I've devoted much of my recent scholarly life to revealing what has been overlooked, there's so much more to do. So we mentioned earlier the blog I've started, The Diverse History of Digital Humanities, but that's obviously not enough. I think the bigger problem is, and I've written about this before, what we have is a record of these projects that's rapidly disappearing. Much as libraries removed and destroyed certain types of publications deemed unimportant, such as maybe women's miscellanies or birthday books, Mary Emma has some great stories that she can tell about what happened when libraries were desegregated and how materials were just tossed. So we have this sort of tradition in the libraries, and we're seeing it happen again with early digital projects that are being removed from servers. To give you one example, in 2011, when I was working on my book, I located Sharon Harris's Early American Women Writers website. She has a few female slave narratives that were on the site that are not digitized nor open access anywhere else, so it was an important site for that kind of work. But by 2014, the site had been removed by Harris from her site at the University of Connecticut, and this was close to her retirement, so I suspect that had something to do with it. So it was completely removed, and when I contacted her to ask her about this, our correspondence revealed that they truly did wipe the site. There are no existing files anymore, that she has nothing. She told me at the time that, well, it wasn't sophisticated, so I didn't see any point to keeping this going. Again, let me remind you, one of the texts on there are the only open access digital version of this particular women's slave narrative that there is. So it's been disappeared again. The recovery work we worked so hard on has been erased. So we're back at the beginning. Now, let me mention that one of our saviors here, crazily enough, is the Internet Archive. And luckily, I have this image because the Internet Archive captured the site 20 times from 2007 to 2014. So there was some sort of ghost there that was picking up. I haven't quite figured out what that was. So we do have some version of this. We don't have her original files. We can't see any of the metadata, but we do have this. This loss is a familiar occurrence, unfortunately. I have seen numerous projects disappear. I was tracking the other day some of the early Maya Angelou works, which have been completely erased from our digital canon. They're just gone away. Because many of these early innovators see their work as displaced from digital humanities, they view their work as unimportant, unsophisticated, without value of preservation, and we're losing these projects rapidly. As we build our alternative digital humanities history, we need to place preservation in the center of the field. And by preservation, I mean, these are not hard sites to preserve, right? These are HTML basic sites. There's a way to do this. All right, I want to wrap up here. So, just one more story, quick wrap up. I was concerned about this and wrote Bethany and Whiskey and Jerome McGann as I was working on my project to ask them for early versions of the Rossetti archive. They too told me they had erased all the materials from the early Rossetti archive and had no idea what the first interface looked like, and Jerry told me to go look at the Internet Archive. So this is not just about small projects. These threads all lead us back to our digital mother's gardens, those foundational projects that use the internet for social justice work, to rethink issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality. And let's remember Alice Walker's word, guided by my heritage of love and beauty and a respect for strength, in search of my mother's garden, I found my own. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions. Yes.
I enjoyed your presentation, but I didn't really hear in the past 2 days the discussion of how to include more minorities in the field of DH.
I think that's a separate issue, and I handle that separately. You're absolutely right. It's a crucial issue that we need to engage with. I don't feel like I had time in this talk. One of the things, can I talk about this, Marianne? Okay. One of the things Marianne and I have been talking about is some of my concern with this, with inclusion, is that a lot of times the work expects folks to get up and go to the DH conference, which is not a particularly welcoming environment. So Marianne and I, and the History of Black Writing folks, have been talking about what happens when you embed sort of DH structures and training within fields or conferences that are traditionally very welcoming, like CLI. So I think those are the kinds of things we need to think about. And in part that means, you know, this is very much what you're talking about this morning. How do we, and even last night in our keynote, how do we make sure that the expertise we have isn't the center of these projects, right? How do we make sure that the folks who control the materials, who want to work in the materials, how do we center those kinds of DH components within those kinds of communities? And I don't know what the answer is. I mean, the problem with the DH conference, just one of the problems with it, is it's hugely expensive. I mean, there's a huge burden on folks just to go to it. Last year was in Australia. I mean, my travel budget wouldn't even pay for the plane ticket, and I'm a tenure track position. I'm a tenured person. So I think these are crucial issues that we need to start unpacking. But you know, I'm just trying to. In this talk, I was just trying to engage with this wonderful issue. A welcome comment. Thank you. Gary?
Thank you very much. I'd like to for you to expand on your title, taking back, because you alluded to Sankofa, which is taking back and also taking forward. And it's very important that we not think of it only as recovering, wresting control, but also moving into futures. And that can be very problematic for all the reasons that you were laying out. And one that concerns me very much is what is happening within the culture, if I might put it that way, of digital humanities, that has to do with those strings of comments that always appear. Now, I've begun to look at those in Facebook, and they're more interesting than what was originally because they are so reflective of the hatred, even among so-called civilized professionals, that gets expressed in the comments, and they're always off topic. It's always a tangential, this is my concern, and it gets really personal ad hominem, ad feminine, etc. So I just would like you to reflect for a moment on how do we join recovering all of those things you talked about, even as we move forward to address his concern about new participants being included.
Yeah, and this is exactly why I wanted to bring this talk to this community, because it seems to me what's happening at this conference is one of the crucial steps forward, right? There haven't been many conferences that specifically address this. This is one of them. The Digital Diversity Conference that was in Canada in May really thought through some of these issues. Unfortunately, I joke that they are the conferences of trauma in some ways, right? Because these are hard issues and disappointing issues that, you know, those of us who have done this work for a long time feel like, you know, we're not making any progress, right? But I think this is the kind of environment where we can begin to strategize on how to go forward. I certainly don't have all the answers. I don't know how to go forward. But I think you're right in that there's a lot of hatred and resistance to moving forward. Certainly the Twitter harassment of certain scholars who sort of stuck their neck out about these issues is not inconsequential. And if the goal is to drive folks out of the field, I think they have successfully done so for certain folks. But that's why, you know, maybe, you know, in part I love this sort of separateness, right? Like you're coming into a separate space. But I think what we have to do is figure out strategies then to go forward from here. So you can't just sort of seclude ourselves. We've got to find a way to sort of take, and this is the taking back. Can we take back the structures? Can we take back the boards of these kinds of organizations and reshift things? Can we take over the programming committee? Right? The digital rhetoric people did a great job on this. They basically bombarded the DH conference until digital rhetoric is now one of the areas of expertise that one can check off. So change can happen, but unfortunately the cost to the individuals involved is still pretty high. But I welcome anyone's thoughts if you know how to move this forward, because I don't have all the answers. It's community issues, it seems to me.
This was on it. I wanted to think through a little bit your issue at the end, and I think from the last talk too about sustainability and structure, more in terms of some of these sites being disappeared, and yes, thank God for Internet Archive and some of those cases. Some of it is structural to how DH began, with sort of professors doing their own thing, hosting these on their own servers or DreamHost or whatever. And I think one of the things that we can do as scholars working in DH at institutions is from the beginning require ourselves to make sure that our projects are institutionalized. And that by that I mean forge partnerships with your library, with whomever, where there's actually, you're locating this on a server at the institution and get a formal agreement with the libraries that says they will maintain these sites in perpetuity. And this is a must also because grants, NEH, NSF, IMLS are all requiring more and more in terms of sustainability. So part of the disappearing is our own sort of, you know, misunderstanding of the novelty of some of these projects, and some of it is very structural at the levels of infrastructure within the university. But if we are there, that there is a real need to make sure that the university is invested in this research, and then that will also bring, you know, visibility to these projects in the long term. And so that, I mean, it may seem like something that's small, but that I think could have a ripple effect in terms of sustainability and structure. And it gets to the issue of some of these community projects too. What happens if the community can't pay for that omeka.net site anymore? I mean, that's my concern and worry. So how is that? Or if we're only training one person, where's the train the trainer program? So that if that person leaves the community center, the next person knows how to use and update Omeka or Mookadoo or times, any of these DH tools that we're creating, that actually education needs to be a key component of it. So grants that we're writing, everything else should have that structure within them.
I agree with you, but it doesn't work. And here's why.
Which part
I
doesn't
agree
work?
with you.
Which
The
part doesn't
preservation issue doesn't work yet. And here's why. Libraries can't do it.
Well, that's not true. Our library
No,
does
they can't. They can't preserve, they can preserve images, they can preserve snapshots, but like the Rossetti project, it's not preserved, it's black box.
Right, but you can preserve the metadata and all the content.
You can.
Yes.
But they don't, in other words, the problem to me is, I want to use these sites.
Right.
But the libraries can't preserve them so they're usable. They can't handle it because there's too much.
They can, they're not. Yeah, they can. You
Well,
absolutely
I don't know if
can.
they can because to make them
Technically,
work.
you can.
Well, maybe.
I mean, in a technical
Maybe.
sense, they can both archive them and make them usable, but the
Maybe,
metadata and all
because
that does
our
not have to
legacy
disappear.
projects, we've had huge problems with this because, say we have the Cervantes project. It's a fabulous project. The way it was built was 20 different graduate students scripted it.
Exactly.
It would take
Yes.
a whole rip down
Yes.
and building up to move it even off the server. So what do we do with that? I mean, that's not preservable except in a very limited way. And that's what I mean. In some ways, these early projects are easier because they don't have all that extra stuff. If they're flat HTML, no problem. But anything with any interactivity, like the Cervantes project has this great tool that they built where you can actually, look at images across, concordances and blah, 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 but it's not preservable. I have this problem with the Emerson website, which I took on and thought, oh, I'll be a nice person to preserve this. I can't get the concordance program out of what it's in.
Interoperability is an issue that everyone faces anywhere, right? Some of these things they're never going to run again, but the content and the metadata can be preserved. It will take work to get back to using it, but at least it's that digital content.
I agree, but I think we need to understand what we mean by content and metadata. And I don't think there's an agreed upon understanding of what we need to preserve.
No, there's not.
Yeah, I mean.
Go to, anywhere across any, yeah. There's
Because
not.
like right now, all our library can do is basically screenshot and do a video voiceover of a project to preserve it, because at least then the person can say, here's the interoperability and here's what it'll do. Because once you roll it off that server, you can't move throughout this website in the way you could, because they're gonna put it in DSpace and that's where it's gonna sit and it's not gonna work in the same way. So that's why I said, some of this is, we could as a community take on projects and fold them into our projects and rebuild them. I've tried to do that. I will tell you that is a hellish thing to do. I've taken on the American Transcendentalist site, and that's been bad in a lot of ways. I've taken on the Emerson Society site, and it's a thankless job and almost impossible. So I'm not trying to be ugly about it.
I'm agreeing with you, and I'm just saying that interoperability and those sorts of running, that's a problem writ large. That's not digital humanities. I mean, this is a problem that the Library of Congress, other people are trying to solve, at much larger scales. I just mean in terms of projects that we're actually doing, to not do sort of rogue scholar projects where you're running it on your own server out under your desk and those sort of things, and instead make these institutional projects.
But this is also another reason that we might think about entry-level DH projects rather than very highly technical projects, because entry-level projects, we have a really good chance of preserving. Highly technical projects, I don't have much hope that we can preserve those. So to me, if I want stuff to live, I almost want to go old school DIY on this stuff. You see what I'm saying? Like, to me, this is a real conundrum, right? And I think it depends on the kinds of work you're doing. Like, Bethany Nabisky had an early Keats archive. It's gone. Do we care? Not so much. It's Keats, right? Like, we can find Keats lots of places. It wasn't doing much other than transcription of text. But the work you're doing, or the work some of these early projects I'm pointing to are doing, once that's gone, we're in real trouble. So I guess
that's why I'm saying I don't think we should actually be building, scripting everything. That's why Wikidata is built on Drupal.
Exactly.
Drupal has 100,000 users worldwide. Whitehouse.gov is built on it. And Drupal's not going away anytime soon. We specifically did that because our original version was built on PHP by a graduate student, and it was great, but there was a lot of chewing gum and duct tape in there, frankly, because it was a one-off. But to make that move, we need to build on existing tools that build in them interoperability and not do, I actually would caution against one-off built from the ground up. I mean, I say that to my grad students all the time. Use Scalar, use Omeka, use these tools that have been around and are gonna continue to be around for the
Totally agree
foreseeable
with you.
future.
Funding structures don't agree with us yet. And that's another whole issue, right? Because you look at what NEH is funding, and they're looking at technological innovation. They're not looking on stuff built into Omeka.
That's not true. They just funded 2 projects that are going to use Mukudu.
Yeah.
So,
But when you look at the whole.
No, I know they do, but they're taking a broader look at innovation now. In the last funding cycles, I mean, they have shifted away from some of that thing. But I agree with you, funding is we're all on the rat race, or at least most of us are.
But again, I mean, this is why I've talked to them about, why don't you all have what I call a historical DH fund? So if I find this project, I want to preserve it, why can't I come to you and get that? And I was told, that's not technological innovation.
The new guidelines that were just released have changed.
They're looking at, they have a new funding stream for that. They don't call it historical, but building.
Yeah.
Something like that.
But like the last week, right?
So
that's excellent news. I know, we're gonna.
Sorry to interrupt. Let's continue our awesome conversations with some food in our tummy. So thank you so much, Amy. Yes, thanks so much.
I think that's happening, yeah.
It was like watching a tennis match. Oh, I got so.
Yeah, I know, the same thing. Well, yes, I mean, so it's a